At the tail end of 2009, rumors began swirling around the internet that American movie company Legendary Pictures, famous for making movies like The Dark Knight, Watchmen, 300, amongst many others, had acquired the rights from Toho to produce a brand new American reboot of Godzilla. A rumor that was started by websites like BloodyDisgusting.com, Ain't It Cool News, and YouTube channels like DeviantSun13, who all speculated about the news, what it could mean, and what exactly was going to go on with the franchise. It didn't take long for these rumors to be confirmed, however, in March of 2010, when not only Legendary but also Toho came out and said that these rumors were indeed true, and that they were going into production on an American Godzilla movie set to be released in the summer of 2012. To commemorate this event, in May of 2010, yours truly sat down and did his very first video about this subject, in which I analyzed what we found out to be later fake picture, supposedly from the movie, representing a Godzilla bust that was going to be the stepping stone for how Godzilla was going to look in the movie, and also a video where I re-envisioned the word with as an adjective. Yeah, I've come a long way. Roughly a year later, we got our first really, truly enormous piece of news that was truly going to shape how the production of the film was going to move on from there. Something that fans had been speculating about for a long time, and that's who was going to direct the movie. With Legendary going in a strange direction, announcing that indie filmmaker Gareth Edwards, who had really only done one major motion picture before that with his independent film Monsters, was going to helm their reboot of The Big G, which everybody was kind of skeptical about because the guy had only done one movie before that. It was very low budget, with the special effects done by him, but it was an interesting kind of fresh take on a monster movie. So it was a smart move and an interesting decision on Legendary's part, but what it did promise, based on the experience of watching Monsters, was a far more grounded and realistic take on Godzilla, which was good. That's what fans were going for. However, what fans were not going for so much was that Legendary also announced, a little bit after this, that the movie was going to be pushed back a year or two to 2014. However, in the summer of 2012, when the movie was supposed to come out, they did decide to release some cool stuff. Mainly at that year's San Diego Comic-Con, where they did a whole panel about the movie, brought Gareth Edwards out, and they showed a concept teaser trailer for the film before shooting had even begun. But very, very famously did not release the trailer online, lighting the internet ablaze with mass speculation, written accounts describing the trailer, which featured Robert Oppenheimer voicing over some imagery of destroyed buildings, and one very, very, now semi-iconic, silhouetted picture of Godzilla roaring, and also lighting the internet ablaze with a whole bunch of controversy because nobody got to see the trailer except the folks who were there, so Godzilla fans were a little bit peeved. Although the trailer did leak online about a year later. In the intervening time, however, I decided to keep myself busy by sitting down and rewatching all the classic Godzilla movies and doing very, very long, perhaps overly so, analyses of them in a little series I did called Godzilla Palooza, a daily series of reviews in which I dug deep into this franchise that I had known since my childhood and learned more about it, noticed things about it, got about as close to it as I ever have in my life, making me even more psyched for the brand new reboot. However, at the end of the series, I attempted to kind of sum up the franchise in order to kind of give it some sense of closure, even though we all knew it wasn't really the end of the franchise, well, because we had one more movie coming out. But it was kind of fitting because it almost felt like I was summing up the history of Godzilla and then looking to the future, namely commenting that we as Godzilla fans were now looking to Legendary Pictures to reinvigorate this legacy that I had just summed up in 2014. Jump ahead roughly a year and change later, and we got our very first look at what Legendary Pictures was doing to pay tribute to that legacy with the very first teaser trailer that came out for Godzilla 2014, which was a mix of actual film footage and stuff taken from that concept teaser that I mentioned earlier, and which leaked a month or two before this teaser trailer came out. The teaser trailer was very, very short and didn't show us much in the way of monster footage, really just being a mood piece for how exactly they were approaching Godzilla. And mood was the big word with this one, giving us a very, very, very terrifying, ominous take on Godzilla that promised to take Godzilla back to its more horrific roots, rather than doing something more cheesy, which fans were ecstatic about. And this impression was further supported a few months later when the full main trailer was released, giving us a more detailed look at the disaster movie tone of the thing, hints of a government cover-up story, and Bryan Cranston saying that we were going to go back to the Stone Age. Both trailers showed us that this Godzilla was going to be very, very serious, downright apocalyptic in tone, and perhaps most importantly to fans, was also going to be very, very careful to leave Godzilla's origins in the 1950s and tied heavily to atomic testing in the 1950s. Which, of course, fans like myself were super ecstatic about, despite some ambiguity as to how exactly he was going to connect to atomic testing in 1954. At this point, the 0 hour was rapidly approaching, and a slow but consistent release of movie trailers kept increasing fans' excitement and interest from the general public, giving us an ever-expanding look at Godzilla's return, and seeming to be everything, including myself, that fans were craving from it. Godzilla looked epic, internet flame wars over feet aside, the story looked engrossing, and Ken Watanabe's comments regarding the power of nature in the trailers assured us that the legacy and poignancy of Godzilla would be respected. But trailers can be deceptive, and ultimately it would all have to come down to the movie itself to see if the Big G was truly back in all his awesome atomic glory, or if the US had just thrown another iguana in the microwave, slapped the name Godzilla on it, and hoped nobody would notice. Well, it was about time to find out, because nearly 5 years after those initial rumors began, and 4 years after the word with was re-envisioned as an adjective by yours truly, Legendary Pictures' Godzilla reboot hit theaters on May 16th, 2014. And caused a tsunami amongst the pop culture ether, shattering box office expectations by several $1 million, breaking the hearts of Bryan Cranston fans everywhere, and also being one of the most polarizing films of recent memory, dividing viewers and Godzilla fans alike on how successfully director Gareth Edwards had reawakened the Big G. Some people called it an epic rebirth that more than respected the legacy. Others called it a cinematic cock tease that put them to sleep. Well, the movie's been out for more than half a year now, and I think I've waited long enough to sit down and give my take on the matter at exactly how well Legendary Pictures did at resurrecting Godzilla. Well, ladies, gentlemen, children, and anybody else who wandered in, I think it's time we reopened that old, crusty, disheveled marble composition notebook and pick up where I left off 2 years ago. Because, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Godzilla Palooza.
Nature has an order, a power to restore balance. I believe he is that power. We call him Godzilla.
Greetings, agents of Monarch, I am Zazubaar, and indeed, welcome back to Godzilla Palooza, the G2014 Addendum. I know it's been a long time coming, I know I promised this video all the way back in September, but here's the whole thing. There was a lot riding on this video for me personally. Because this video has been a long time coming, having done my first video about this movie 4 years ago, in which I knew nothing about it, just spouting off my own bullshit on how I thought the movie should be handled. Well, now I'm sitting down with the Blu-ray, seeing it sitting on my DVD shelf right next to Godzilla Final Wars, and about to record my full-on analysis of it. there was a lot of build-up to doing this, and that's why I wanted to do that retrospective of the kind of history of this movie in order to build up to that moment, to kind of recapture how long and how much energy I'd personally devoted into thinking about this movie, thinking how I thought the movie should work, and thinking about how the movie might do with or without my own thoughts. So, it was a weird experience. I mean, almost my entire high school career was spent with this movie almost looming over us. It was coming, whether we wanted it or not, though I personally wanted it, and I spent so much time thinking about it. Every time a big summer blockbuster would come out, I would go see it, and regardless of whether it was The Avengers or Man of Steel, I would think, wow, that was really good, or oh, that was disappointing. And then based on those movies, I would then think, wow, I wonder what Godzilla's going to be like if that's what a modern action movie looks like. So it was always on my mind. But the other thing was that this movie was not just important to me personally, but it was kind of important to the entire fandom for a bunch of different reasons. Because prior to this point, we went through a drought in regards to Godzilla. Probably all the way up until 2011, when we got really the first new Godzilla thing in years with the IDW comics. And we, of course, had mixed feelings about their version of Godzilla. But anyway, the history of the Godzilla franchise was kind of riding on this. Whether or not it was going to continue, or whether or not this would be it. If this movie was awesome, there'd be a bountiful future waiting for Godzilla. If it sucked and it bombed and everybody hated it, maybe not so much. So a lot of fans were putting a lot of pressure on this movie to be great, so that way we could go, alright, it's a new beginning, Godzilla's alive again, and now we're going to have a bunch of new movies to talk about and sink our teeth into. Which is something that we wanted. We wanted a live, fresh Godzilla franchise because we hadn't had one in so long. It had been 10 years since Godzilla Final Wars came out. And even years after games and the comics had started, though the comics did continue, which was the only new Godzilla thing us Americans were getting for years. So there was a lot riding on this movie. And the other thing was that, aside from the future of seeing more Godzilla movies, a lot of Godzilla fans were looking at this movie to kind of give Godzilla a new sense of street cred, because the Godzilla fandom and Godzilla fans have kind of been mocked throughout the years for being Godzilla fans. The franchise was never taken seriously by anybody who had never sat down and watched one of the movies, and even if they did, they still might not take it seriously. So Godzilla fans felt a sense of frustration, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, at people not being able to get over certain things about the series and see what was truly great about it. And I think a lot of us were looking to this movie to recapture everything great about Godzilla, throw it up on an American movie screen, liven it up with all the fresh tapestries of a modern movie and all the modern sensibilities that go along with filmmaking, because I think that's a lot of the reason why a lot of people cannot get into Godzilla nowadays. They look at the movies, and regardless of whether or not them being old, they're just made with a different mindset and a different set of rules, and they're hard to get into from a modern film perspective. For us Godzilla fans, it's a little different since we grew up with them, so we're kind of used to all that wackiness and all the different production things. And I know for me personally, knowing a lot of the production background, it's kind of easier for me to watch one of the movies and go, oh yeah, Rodan's fell into the water because when they were wearing the suit, the wire broke. So that's not a problem to me, that's just a fact of what the movie is. A lot of them, it's hard for me to look at critically for that very reason. They're so close to me, I know so much about them, I have so much history with them, that it's not the same to me as when I got into Doctor Who and would watch an episode from 2006 and go, yeah, I didn't really like this. But people who were watching Doctor Who as it aired when they were younger would go, oh, but that was like that because of this, and this. And it's like, I didn't grow up with it in that way, and I didn't know that when I was watching it, so it was kind of harder for me to get over those hurdles. I mean, I still became a Doctor Who fan, but I'm just using that as an example. So my point is that Godzilla fans were looking to the 2014 movie for some kind of credibility in America. For people to watch that movie and go, I get it. I get why this is important. I get why this is cool. I get why you like this. So there was a lot riding on this movie for me personally, for the Godzilla fans at large, and even for the general public to a certain degree. I mean, you know, the months building up to the movie coming out, and I go to a film school, so this might be a little different for me because I'm surrounded by geek culture 24/7. Everybody, even people who weren't Godzilla fans, saw those initial trailers and went, oh my god, this movie looks like the greatest thing ever. And it got me excited, because I'm like, oh my god, people who didn't give a crap about Godzilla are giving a crap about a Godzilla movie. It was really exciting, and it was kind of a great time to be a Godzilla fan. So again, there was a lot riding on this movie for a lot of different people. And the other thing for me personally was that this was a really big movie for me, not just in terms of, oh, I made a lot of videos about it on YouTube. Oh, I met a lot of friends because of this movie. The history of the Sons of Serizawa is dependent upon the existence of this movie, because I met David for the first time to do a video about this movie. I met Adam because of that video I did with David. I met Dylan and Andres because of the videos I did with Adam and David. It's all a snowball effect, all leading back to this movie. I owe this movie a lot of the stuff that I love in my life, which is really bizarre. And some people may be saying, oh, that's really sad. But you know what? It's the truth, and I am so grateful to it for that, regardless of this review that I'm about to do. And what I may say against it that may not be great, regardless of my problems with Godzilla 2014, I will always thank it for the things that it gave me. And the other thing was that it was a kind of an important movie for me as a film fan, because it was the first time I had to wait a long time for a specific movie to come out, and had a lot of time to really build up excitement. It increased the size of it in my life. If I had found out about it a year before it came out, and then it would have come out, it probably wouldn't have been as a big of a deal. It probably would have been a big deal, but spending all those years thinking about it, all those years under its shadow, really went a long way for me to building it up in my mind as this big event. So, with all that said, then came the movie's release. And I treated it appropriately. I got a bunch of my friends together, I had a party at my house, I had a great time. And then we went to go see the movie. And it was this really cathartic experience, because it was like the build-up and then the aftermath. So the moment in between, seeing the movie itself, sitting there, taking in what I was watching on the screen, the reality of the thing, was nearly impossible. Because all those years of build-up, that party, those videos, the SOS, everything, was being summed up in a 2-hour movie. And it made it nearly impossible to sit there and objectively go, oh yeah, that's a good thing that they did. Or, oh yeah, that's a crappy thing that they did. This is good. This is bad. Whatever. It was just what it was. And I wasn't really able to appreciate what the movie was actually doing. I was just kind of taking it in. Just kind of sitting there with my mouth open going, oh, that's what that is. Oh, that's what that picture meant that I saw 2 years ago. So it was a bizarre experience in that way. And I'm really glad that I've waited so long to do this review, intentional or unintentional as it may be, because I've really let that experience not dictate how good I actually think this movie is. Because when I saw the movie for the first time, and I've talked about this again before, so this shouldn't come as a shock to anybody who follows my channel, I had really, really mixed feelings about it. I thought it was okay, and that it wasn't at all what anybody expected it to be. And that was the really bizarre part about it, was that it was completely different than those trailers had made it out to be. And despite getting a lot of stuff, or including a lot of stuff rather, that fans had talked about wanting, it wasn't exactly what we wanted. And I think that's why a lot of people reacted really negatively to it the first time they saw it. But I was really careful not to do that when I walked out of that movie theater. Because thinking about it while I was walking around for the next day and a half, and then going to see it again with a completely different person, really helped me to go, alright, I didn't like how they handled Godzilla's origin the first time I saw it. And then I saw it again, and I was like, you know what? That kind of works. And that's why I also urge everybody to watch a movie multiple times and see it with different people, because you get to see it from different perspectives and you get to appreciate different aspects of it when you watch it. So I'm really glad that I did that, and then more than that, I saw the movie a bunch of other times in theaters when it was still in its original theatrical run, had a different experience every time I saw it, and then I've seen it like 5 or 6 times on my own, in my house, with my Blu-ray, one time not so legally before the movie was released on Blu-ray, and I got, again, completely different experience. Every time I watch this movie, Prior to these past couple weeks, it was a completely different experience. One time I thought it was okay. One time I thought it was brilliant, one of the best movies ever made, one of my favorite movies of all time, one of the top 5 best Godzilla movies. Then I saw it again and I was like, what was I thinking? It's still just okay. Saw it again, then I'm like, ooh, maybe this movie's shifting more towards the bad. Oh, maybe it's shifting more towards the good. And then finally, I hit a point where every time I would watch it, and I'm making it sound like I've seen it a million times, I've seen it a little bit over a dozen, which is still a lot, mind you. Having seen it all those times, I've gotten to a point with it where the reality of the movie has finally sunk in. I've realized the things that it achieves, and then the things that it doesn't. The things that I like, and the things that I don't like have become consistent. Every time I watch the movie, I have the same feelings about certain aspects than I do about other aspects. So I think it has never been a better time than any to finally sit down and do my Godzilla Palooza addendum and analyze Godzilla 2014 within the context of this past series. Now here's the other thing about it. Godzilla Palooza, when I announced it and when I pitched it, was as a retrospective look at the franchise, having been years since any of the movies I was going to review was going to come out. Even the newest one with Final Wars, it had been, 8 years since Final Wars had come out? I was a kid when Final Wars came out. So it still had that retrospective look, despite how new one movie would be relative to another. So, and the other thing was that I was not only analyzing them as individual movies, or not even just as movies as part of a franchise, but I was also analyzing the character of Godzilla over time as new things were added, as changes to his characterization were made over time, the things that stuck, the things that didn't, and the things that became the most iconic about the series. But then also how the movies were affecting kind of the legacy of the character and the history of the character. They were as much historical analyses as they were critical film reviews, I feel. And when I was thinking about doing this video, I really thought long and hard about how I was going to approach it, which is why this intro has been so long. Because I was thinking, do I want it to be a in-depth spoiler analysis of the movie right after it came out? Or do I want it to be that equal retrospective review a while after it came out? So initially the plan was the Blu-ray would come out, I would grab it and do the review. So that was the plan. That seemed like the most logical thing to do, to let the movie have its impact and then review it in the context of Godzilla Palooza. The problem was I was doing another Palooza while the movie came out, Gamera Palooza, which you can now watch on my channel, which is done in the same style as Godzilla Palooza was, but obviously for Gamera. So obviously it wasn't going to happen immediately afterwards, so I knew it would be some time before I finally sat down and do it. But, again, I'm glad I waited as long as I did because I've let the movie get to a point of consistency that it wasn't before, and also given it plenty of time to impact the culture. Plenty of time to resonate with the world at what the movie is, and how exactly it has impacted Godzilla history, because it has. Regardless of people's feelings about it, regardless of how the movie objectively is, it has affected the franchise and the history. So now I think it's finally fitting to sit down and do the overly long critical analysis of Godzilla 2014. So, with all that rambling out of the way, let's begin. Well, it's a weird movie, because despite all the trailers and everything building up to it, showing it to be seemingly what everybody wanted, what I had been talking about in all the videos I did, you know, it looked like a dark, gritty take on Godzilla. It seemed to be going back to the horrific elements. The allegory seemed to be retained from the original Gojira. It was going back to the original Gojira. Everything seemed to be in place for the perfect American reboot of Godzilla. But I am going to summarize my feelings on the movie with somebody else's words, so I apologize for these words not being of my own, but they're the best way and most intelligent way I've heard the movie summed up, so I'm going to use this person's word. J.D. Lees, the head of G-Fest and G-Fan magazine, G-Fest being the Godzilla fan convention over here in America that's held in Chicago every year. I went last year, had a great time. And at last year's convention, he summed up, and the movie was on everybody's mind, so this was inevitable. He summed up the movie in his own words as being good, but not it. Everybody was expecting this movie to be it, but it was good, but it wasn't it. Now, what does it mean exactly? Basically, it refers to this being the end-all, be-all, perfect summarizing of Godzilla, as I attempted to do at the end of Godzilla Palooza. Now, we can debate about how successfully I did that in that series, but that's what I attempted to do, and that's what I think everybody expected this movie to be like. The perfect sum-up of what's good about Godzilla. On a movie screen, it was going to be perfect. The greatest Godzilla movie ever made. Everything good about the series, all 29 movies, was going to be encapsulated on that movie screen. That there would never have to be another Godzilla movie after this, although we all wanted there to be more, because this would be the perfect sum-up. Everything would be done perfectly. It would focus on the humans enough. It would focus on the monsters enough. It would tell a great, solid Godzilla story. It would be fun, but it would be poignant. That was the it that J.D. Lees referred to that people wanted this movie to be. Now, how did it turn out? He said good, and I agree with him. Because I think how the best sum up Godzilla 2014 in my own words is that it's a mixed bag of good and not so good execution of really, really good ideas. Awesome ideas that seem befitting and excellent to do in a modern retelling of Godzilla. And the issue, by and large, is that some of the ideas are executed really well, and some of them are not executed so well. Very few of the ideas presented in the film, I think, can be called objectively poor ideas. But we'll get into that when we get into specifics, because I think all of the ideas on display here are great ideas that should have been attempted with a modern-day Godzilla reboot. And they attempted them. But the problem comes in where ultimately all films live and die, and that's how they're executed. You can rant and rave about how good an idea is on paper, but at the end of the day, it's how it emotionally resonates with the movie watcher. And sadly, a lot of the best ideas about Godzilla don't really hit their mark. Now, where the film excels in my eyes is as an entertaining, beautifully conceived from a directorial and script standpoint monster movie, with wonderful build-up, atmosphere, and a really intriguing story that builds well. Not to mention cutting CGI effects that make these fantastic, unreal creatures look completely photoreal. But sadly, where the film comes up short, and where I think it really needed to excel, is as a modern resurrection of Godzilla. Which is really, really, really frustrating, because that's what everybody wanted it to be. It was a fantastic reboot to that franchise. To see this character that everybody loved summed up and given his due on an American movie screen. And sadly, that's where the movie really, really struggles, and where the most amount of problems and frustrations come with it. It's not irreverent to the source material at all like 98 was. The complete opposite. The film is extremely reverential and respectful to not only the character, but the history of Godzilla and Godzilla fans. It's very careful to be that way, because 16 years of hatred on somebody else trying to re-envision Godzilla for Americans has not been treated that way. It's been treated with being one of the worst movies ever made, nobody liking it, and Roland Emmerich never being able to shake off that movie in terms of his relationship with critics and film viewers because of what he did to Godzilla. Legendary, Gareth Edwards, and everybody involved wanted to be damn sure that they couldn't be pegged with that. So the movie is very faithful to the source material. The problem is that it just doesn't give it the proper focus or impact. Godzilla isn't enough of the star of the show here, and it gets really frustrating because, again, it's super faithful to the source material in the scenes where it's focused upon, and Godzilla himself is spectacularly realized for the portions that are about him. Those moments are jaw-dropping levels of awesome. The best moments of the movie, some of the best moments in modern film history. And watching the movie, learning about the production, sitting here with it in my lap, the Blu-ray being right here, and me being able to think about it, you begin to realize that there's a really spectacular Godzilla story here that could potentially be the perfect modern version of the story. Almost as good as I think Godzilla 84 is, though there's some debate on how great that movie is, of course. But in regards to bringing Godzilla back, keeping him faithful to his roots, and telling a story that befits a modern setting, it really comes up lacking because of how much it's shoved into the background. Now, in addition to that, you throw in some pacing issues, a mixed range of character development, and a bit of prominence put on film theory, rather than just taking things to natural places. And there you've got a Godzilla movie with a lot of flaws, but one that still has a lot to offer. I don't want to make it sound like I'm crapping on this movie saying that it's bad. Again, to the contrary, I think it's a really, really good monster movie, really entertaining. And it's one of those movies that while you're watching it, most of the problems that you have with it are really put into, just like Godzilla in the movie, put into the background, because what's on screen when he is not focused upon isn't bad, it's just not what you're there to see. And therefore, it's less interesting than that. But let's get into all the specifics. That's a lot of really general overview stuff, but it's time to get into the nitty-gritty. Dig as deep in as I did with the original Godzilla 84, Final Wars, all the classic Godzilla movies. It's time to give the modern one the same treatment. Let's get into specifics by doing a plot synopsis. Now, with this plot synopsis, as I always like to do in these Palooza analysis videos, I did them with Gamera, I did them with Godzilla, this movie's a little bit tricky, because the overarching plot is really, really simple, but the specifics are quite complicated. So here's how I'm going to approach this plot synopsis to make this video as short as possible, but while also giving everything its proper due. I am going to give a general overview of the A to B story, and then get into all the really, really specific stuff when I talk about the stuff that I like about the movie, the stuff that I don't like about it, what I think the movie is about overall. But let's summarize the story to get kicking off with the specifics. So basically, here's what Godzilla 2014 is about, the story. The movie opens with some amazing opening credits that really get you psyched for the movie, that basically give an overview of the events of 1954, that a mysterious creature appeared in the South Pacific and was taking down American boats and submarines, that the United States covered up and created an organization called Monarch to track and deal with the creature, wanting to keep it covered up because the reveal of its existence would be terrifying to the world at large and cause massive amounts of panic. So in order to get rid of the problem quickly and quietly, they decide to cover up trying to kill the creature with atomic testing by luring the creature, who they dub Gojira, based on an ancient South Seas legend, to a group of islands called the Bikini Atoll, where they were already doing some atomic testing, and launch a hydrogen bomb on the thing, attempting to kill the creature. But was it successful? Well, cut ahead a little bit under 50 years later to 1999 in the Philippines, and Monarch is still around. Now being seemingly headed, this is kind of left ambiguous, by a scientist named Ishiro Serizawa and his assistant Dr. Vivian Graham. Graham and Serizawa are in the Philippines because of a mine collapse in which a strange, unknown fossil was discovered that was spilling out radiation all over the joint, killing a bunch of miners and giving a whole bunch of other miners radiation sickness, which they don't show in the movie, but they really should have, because it's a great scene that's described in the book. But anyway, they go down into the cavern where the fossil is, Serizawa determining it to be a fossil of a Gojira-like creature, but also discovering two dormant spores inside of the creature's body. Not fossilized like the bones, but rather well preserved. Seemingly to be parasitic spores, one of them is perfectly dormant, but the other one is gone, having been broken open, revealing that something hatched out of it and escaped the cavern and is now heading towards, what? Japan. In Japan, we're introduced to the Brody family, mainly Joe, Sandra, and Ford. Joe and Sandra working at the local nuclear Janjira power plant as engineers. Joe's tracking some seismic activity leading from the Philippines, which has been covered up as an earthquake and not revealing that a giant monster's in the way. Joe and Sandra go to the power plant to try and figure out what's going on, Sandra going down into the reactor to make sure that all the sensors are working and that nothing's going to crack open and release a whole bunch of radiation. The seismic activity continues, though, and shakes up the foundations of the building. And of course, big problem, causing the reactor to go into meltdown despite them trying to turn it off. Joe goes running down to the reactor to try and get his wife out, standing near the door where the reactor connects to the rest of the plant, waiting for his wife to come through. Sandra and her team try and make it, but ultimately don't, as the radiation comes careening towards them, and Joe being forced to close the doors without his wife. They have a heartfelt goodbye as Sandra comes to the door and takes off her mask, her fate being sealed, as well as the doors. The entire plant comes down, leaving their son, Ford, who's in a nearby school, seeing the destruction and devastation. We then cut 15 years later to the modern day, where Ford is an Army EOD technician, meaning explosive ordnance disposal, and he's living with his family in San Francisco, his wife Elle and his son Sam. Ford just got back from several months of active duty over in the generic Middle East, and is having some intimate time with his wife and promising his son that he's going to be there tomorrow. His son obviously being concerned that his dad's going to up and leave again. Which, guess what, kid, he does, as they get a call from the Japan consulate in San Francisco saying that Ford's father, Joe, has been arrested in Japan for attempting to break into the Q Zone, which is the quarantined area of the Janjira power plant and the surrounding city where the reactor supposedly melted down. Ford goes to Japan, bails his dad out of prison, and his dad has some choice words for his son, attempting to bring him back into trying to discover what exactly happened to Sandra back in 1999. Joe thinking that the whole thing wasn't on the level, that there wasn't that what exactly caused the meltdown is being covered up, because ultimately he blames himself. He sent his wife down there, he was the engineer of the plant, so he wants to find out what exactly happened. He convinces Ford to go with him back to the Q Zone because he's been getting some readings that he thinks line up exactly with the readings that happened that day. He thinks that what happened then is going to happen again, so he convinces Ford and they go back into the Q Zone to go back to their old house to try and get some discs that actually have the information of the exact readings of that day so he can prove that they're the same. Joe finds the discs that contain all the proper information on it, but also finds a photo of him, his wife, and his child, which he wasn't able to get access to because of how quickly they were evacuated from the city. He and Ford leave the house, but are drawn to a helicopter which enters the Q Zone and flies over to where the power plant was, which has now been completely flattened out and replaced with some other sort of facility. But before they can leave, Joe and Ford are taken in by some armored guards, who arrest them and take them to this facility and are interrogating Joe. But before they start interrogating them, Joe notices something strange in the center of the plant. An enormous black object that's beaming orange. Joe says to some dudes who work at the plant that he knows that what they're doing isn't on the level, and is being watched by none other than Dr. Serizawa, who comments that he thought that all the data from that day was lost, and that this new information may change how they approach the oncoming events. Noticing that the readings that they're getting off of the object right now are consistent with the readings that Joe Brody got that day, which makes him realize that something's going to happen. And something does, as the entire facility is hit with an EMP strike, shutting off all the electricity. Joe Brody saying that it's all building to something big, something major is going to happen, and him also saying that it's going to send them back to the Stone Age. So Serizawa reacts in kind, saying that things have gotten out of hand and that they need to kill it being a thing inside of the black object, which we realize to be a cocoon for some kind of creature. They shock the thing with electricity, but it's too late, and a big old monster comes erupting out of the cocoon and destroys the facility, killing a bunch of people and releasing another EMP that lets Joe Brody out, his son out, them both attempting to escape the facility. The MUTO goes on a rampage, and in the crossfire of the attack actually kills Joe Brody, knocking him off of a bridge, including a whole bunch of other Japanese people. Ford watches his father die, and then attempts to escape the monster's wrath as it comes out of its little like hole grid thing. The creature then erupts wings and flies away, Ford barely surviving. The next morning, Serizawa oversees the wreckage of the power plant. We also learn that Joe didn't actually die, but is just critically injured, and Ford and him are about to be taken to a hospital when Serizawa is approached by some military dudes, American military dudes, who are saying that they're now tracking the creature and that they need him to come with them in order to help track it and deal with the situation before the general public finds out about it. But he doesn't know everything about it himself and wants to know exactly what Joe Brody knew about it, so he takes him and his son with him up in the helicopter. However, during the helicopter ride over to the aircraft carrier where they're going to track the creature, Joe Brody sadly dies, having the parting words to his son to protect his family whatever it takes. We're introduced to Admiral Stantz, who gives the creature its name, the term MUTO, which is an acronym for Massive Unidentified Terrestrial Organism, and that they can't actually track the creature on radar because of the creature's EMP, so it's a strictly visual pursuit. Meanwhile, Serizawa gets Ford into a and a bunch of other people into this conference room and explain what the hell's going on. Serizawa gives the backstory of who he and Graham are, working for the organization called Monarch, which was established back in the 50s to, of course, study this giant fucking dinosaur creature that popped up there called Gojira. Well, that's how Serizawa says it. Later on, people start calling him Godzilla, so for the rest of the review, I will, of course, call him Godzilla. They explain that Godzilla and the creature that popped up in Janjira today come from a time when the Earth was 10 times more radioactive and that they feed on radiation as a food source, the MUTO using the radiation of the Janjira power plant to grow into its adult form, saying that it's going to be seeking more sources of radiation, but that they didn't know about the EMP attack, Joe being able to predict it, and Serizawa wants more information about what exactly he knew about the creature. Ford doesn't know much and just says that his father said something about an animal call, something talking, and also had books on echolocation. Serizawa hearing this and realizing that the MUTO might have been talking to something else and sends Graham to go take another look. Them lamenting that if they don't find it soon, something's going to happen. Ford asks what's going to happen, and Serizawa just says that nature has a power to restore balance and that Godzilla is that power, implying that if the MUTO isn't stopped soon, Big G's going to wake up and take care of business. The MUTO heads to Hawaii with a Russian submarine $5 footlong in tow, feeding on it, and kills a whole bunch of military personnel on the island who were tracking the submarine. Meanwhile, on the USS Saratoga, Admiral Stantz is trying to deal with the situation and trying to figure out what to do about the MUTO because there's a whole bunch of people on the island, so no longer it's about keeping secrets and that it's just about safety at this point, that they just need to take care of the creature as effectively as possible. However, they also get another blip on the radar. Something is heading towards the island from the sea, and Serizawa runs up to the flight deck to take a look. Meanwhile, Ford heads to the airport to try and catch a flight back to San Francisco, which is promptly attacked by the male MUTO, who knocks out all the lights in Honolulu. The military attempts to take the MUTO down, but the EMP attack prevents any air support from attacking the creature. However, from the Pacific, something comes a-comin', and 3 very iconic spikes are seen erupting out of the water as Serizawa looks at them with his binoculars and approaches the island. A huge tsunami hits the city as people flee for their lives and head up to the roofs to try and escape the water. With all the lights out, though, they can't exactly tell what erupted out of the water until some military dudes fire some flares up into the sky, which illuminate what exactly came out of the water. And we just see a wall of prehistoric scales. And the terrified reactions of some people. Yup, Godzilla has returned and has come for the MUTO. Godzilla heads to the airport, in which we finally see him in all his glory, and, well, supposedly has a fight with the MUTO. We don't exactly see it. We see it a little bit on a TV screen. But the MUTO escapes and Godzilla chases in pursuit. Ford barely surviving the fight, and also protecting a young Japanese boy from being killed in the crossfire. The young Japanese boy is reunited with his family, and Ford hooks up with some local soldiers who are heading east towards where the creatures are heading. Serizawa and Graham are trying to catch up on what exactly is going on, saying that Godzilla is hunting the MUTO and that he'll chase him for as long as he's around. However, what Graham doesn't understand is why exactly the male MUTO would call up a predator. Why would he talk to Godzilla? And Serizawa says he didn't, saying that Godzilla was only listening to a conversation that the MUTO was actually having with, gasp, a female MUTO, which was in the dormant spore, which had been transported to Nevada after it was discovered in the Philippines. But everybody was convinced that it was completely dormant because, well, it seemed dead. However, thanks to all of the radiation in the Yucca Mountains nuclear containment facility, which is where America dumps all its atomic waste, the creature was able to feed off of that and become a fully formed adult itself, to head off to try and meet up with its lover, who she's only been talking to, and destroys the city of Las Vegas. Meanwhile, the military tries to cook up a plan to deal with the monsters, using the fact that they're attracted to radiation as a food source as a plus in order to try and make the battle go their way. They've decided to use a couple of nuclear warheads to attract the monsters to a specific point offshore, where they can lead the MUTO'S there with the radiation and lead Godzilla there with the MUTO'S in order to blow them all up in one fell swoop. Serizawa and Graham mention that this is a dumb idea because they feed on the radiation and that if they blow them up with the bomb, it'll only make them stronger, but everybody says that, oh, the sheer force of the blast will be enough to kill them. But Graham and Serizawa still think it's a bad idea, but Admiral Stantz reminds them that they don't really have any other options. But they're open to ideas. However, Graham just moves off in a huff, and Serizawa just pitched the idea of Godzilla being here to restore balance, that if they just get out of the way and let Godzilla do his thing, he'll take care of the MUTO'S himself and then return back to the sea. But Admiral Stantz says, but he's a big destructive monster too, who killed millions of people in Hawaii, so we're not just going to sit by and watch. And that they're going to move ahead with the nuke plan. But Serizawa tries to appeal to his humanity by showing him that he's dealt with nukes before, by showing him the watch that he was looking at the beginning of the movie, which we learn was the watch of his father, which he had on him during the dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima in 1945. Serizawa showing that he don't have much love for the nuclear weapons. In the meantime, Ford is on a plane with a bunch of other soldiers, which is redirected from San Francisco to California, where a train is being mocked up with a couple of nuclear warheads on it to be moved to the coast, where they're going to lure all of the creatures so they can blow them all up. Ford tries to get on this train because his family is in San Francisco, and he wants to do what his dad said, get to them and protect them from all the monster mayhem. He coerces himself to get on the train as the EOD, because what their plan is to retrofit the nukes with an analog device rather than a digital timer that they would use to remote detonate them, because the MUTO'S are knocking out everything with EMP blasts. So this instead will be a classic kind of clockwork timer that will run entirely on analog and won't require any digital input, so that way the MUTO'S can't knock it out and fuck around with it, which would probably cause an explosion. Ford gets on the train and heads over to San Francisco, but of course, as per usual, things don't go well for our protagonist, as the female MUTO attacks the train, attempting to get her hands on the nuke, or her claws rather, on the nuke, destroying the train, getting one of the nukes, killing everybody else on the train except Ford, sending Ford careening into a river, and being the only survivor, with only one nuke left. Also in a rather disgusting shot, showing us that the female MUTO is already pregnant, Serizawa is saying that the MUTO'S are going to meet up and spawn, which would be a huge problem because, well, if two MUTO'S are enough to cause all this mayhem, imagine how much a whole bunch of them could cause. So obviously things are a little bit bleak. However, they've still got one nuke that they think will be able to attract all of the monsters. So they fly the nuke out to San Francisco, building up to the final confrontation as all three monsters are converging on San Francisco Bay. Godzilla being the first one, who pops up by the Golden Gate Bridge while the city is being evacuated, including Ford's son. Godzilla causes a whole bunch of fucking destruction, knocking over a whole bunch of boats, and careening through the Golden Gate Bridge as he waits for the MUTO'S to come so he can, well, kill them. The next to arrive is the male MUTO, who attacks the boat that the nuclear weapon is on, which has already been armed. The male MUTO attacks the boat and brings it into the city, where he meets up with the female and they begin to do happy things. Meanwhile, Godzilla erupts out of the water and begins his fight with the male MUTO once again, and tries to kill the two monsters before they mate and spawn. Meanwhile, the military's got a whole new problem on their hands, because not only do they have three giant monsters fighting in the middle of a major metropolitan area, now they've got an active nuclear weapon in the middle of said metropolitan area with millions of people caught in the crossfire. Oops. So they need to send in another team into the city to deactivate the nuke, or get it on a boat and bring it out before it blows up if they can't access the timer, before it blows up not only the monsters but the entirety of San Francisco. Ford, being the one who installed the device, is immediately given access to the team, and they are going to be inserted into the city with what's called a halo insertion, with a flight so high up in the atmosphere that the MUTO'S EMP won't be able to interact with it. They drop the soldiers into San Francisco as Godzilla is fighting the two MUTO'S, and they head towards the female MUTO's nest, where she's already laid her eggs and has already wrapped them around the nuke, feeding off of it. The soldiers get to the nest as Godzilla confronts the female MUTO and remove the nuke, but of course the timer's been damaged and they can't access it. So they're going to have to get it to the bay and put it on a boat, having to navigate the field of giant monster battle before they can do that. They move out the nuke, but Ford realizes that it's now or never to deal with this whole situation and needs to blow up the nest. So he opens up a gas main, releasing a whole bunch of gasoline into the nest, and then blows it to smithereens, killing all the baby MUTO'S. which obviously the female does not take well, running from her battle with Godzilla and running over to her now dead babies. Ford trying to get away, but the female sees him, attempts to kill him, but of course Ford is saved by the Big G, who fucking blows the female MUTO away. Godzilla's battle with the MUTO'S continues as Ford and the other soldiers try and get down to the bay to get the nuke on a boat and send it out. However, Godzilla is distracted by his battle with the male MUTO and is unable to deal with the female as she charges towards the bay and kills all them motherfuckers before they can start getting the boat out away from the city. In the meantime, Godzilla kills the male MUTO with his tail by slapping it into a building and knocking the building down, getting caught in the building coming down on himself, so Godzilla's kind of out of action. Ford and Godzilla have a little moment, and Ford runs down to the bay to try and secure the bomb before the female MUTO gets to it and before it explodes. He's able to get the boat moving and heading towards the water. However, with only 10 minutes left, the female has dealt with all the soldiers and is now heading towards Ford, Godzilla obviously being out of action. Ford realizes that his fate is basically sealed, aims his pistol at the 300-foot-tall indestructible monster, and seems like he's about to die, when suddenly help comes from an unexpected place as Godzilla pops up behind the female MUTO, grabs that bitch, rips open her mouth, and breathes atomic fury down her mouth, ripping her head off, killing the female, and having both monsters dead. The boat continues to move out, far enough away. Godzilla collapses from being tired in San Francisco. Ford does the same. But before the bomb is able to go off and kill Ford, a helicopter comes, saves Ford, the bomb goes off, the day is saved, San Francisco is saved, and the world owes it all to Ford and Godzilla. Ford's reunited with his family the next day, as everybody laments the fact that Godzilla seems to be dead, until, of course, he wakes up, rises out of the ashes, Serizawa and Graham smile, the world cheers at the savior of the King of the Monsters, and Godzilla returns to the sea, nature being at peace. So overall, what do I think of this story? Well, I actually think it's pretty good as a monster story. The first half is fantastic, really building up the situation well, really getting the audience invested in the government conspiracy with finding out what exactly happened, and also really getting immersed in this rich world that's filled with backstory. I like that Godzilla's origins are left in the past here, and that we're able to just kind of get wrapped up in the situation now with all this stuff kind of building in the background. It allows for a rich world that's really fun to be in and learn about as we move along the story. The discovery that something weird is going on with the monster is a really, really classic Toho-esque story, and it feels like a classic Toho movie, fitting since this is a modern rebirth of the Godzilla franchise. And the human story is also really, really strong here, with the tragedy of Ford and Joe losing Sandra, and the connection of this tragedy in their family to this monster conspiracy. It leads to an emotional but also really fun journey to find out the truth, getting you really wrapped up in the build-up, which is good for a monster story that's really, really slowly paced, which this movie is, at least in the first hour. It's really slow and takes its time to establish every little facet of this world and these characters and how they react to certain situations. It's really good in that way. It really fleshes out the whole thing. But as with any good monster movie, and as with any good movie, I should say, the film has a really strong sense of purpose. The purpose is Ford and Joe need to fix their relationship as father and son, and need to discover what happened to Sandra and what happened to Janjira, so that way they can finally put all these skeletons in the closet to rest and move on with their lives. All of this is really, really fantastic and really, really fun, intriguing. It's a perfect monster movie story up until a certain point. The problem with the movie from a human story and also just from a story pacing perspective is that all of the interesting story stuff happens in the first hour. The story takes its time and fleshes everything out, but the problem is that once it does that, it's all resolved halfway before the movie is over. And also, before Godzilla is even introduced in the story. The problem with all this really good build-up is that it really feels like the movie was kind of wasting its time a little bit, because as good as all that was, we're not even getting to the reason why the movie is here, which is to reintroduce Godzilla until after all the really interesting story stuff has happened. It's a really bizarre story problem. It just feels like all the interesting stuff is cut off, and there's this really weird lull right when Joe Brody dies, because the movie loses that sense of purpose that he was perpetuating. He was forcing Ford to take a look at the past and go, we need to solve this problem, we need to find out what's going on. That was the whole point of getting to Japan, learning about the conspiracy, going back to Janjira, and seeing the Muto waking up. It's a really, really good monster movie kind of pacing. And just a good movie pacing. We feel like we're discovering things as we need to discover them. There's a really strong buildup of personal human story to government conspiracy to, oh my god, there's a giant monster. It's a great build. And only seeing snippets of Godzilla in the opening credits and not seeing the male Muto at all in the prologue of the movie, meaning everything that happened in 1999, it really lends a lot of credit to that slow build of all the human stuff. Okay, now there's a monster, good. But the problem is, again, that it feels a little bit strange because the human story feels complete. The monster is awake. Okay, now what? Well, Joe Brody's dead, so that sense of purpose is kind of lost. We feel like the whole movie has now kind of lost what it was getting at. The Muto is now awake. Okay, now what? Now I guess we have to kill it. And again, the issue is that all of this build-up, as good as it was, is not about Godzilla. We feel like we've gotten to a place, and now the movie feels lost trying to give itself a new sense of purpose, because the old one is now gone with Joe Brody being dead. So the new sense of purpose is now, well, okay, Serizawa's going to introduce Godzilla and say that he's coming to kill the Muto. Okay, well, now we're waiting for Godzilla to show up. Alright, Godzilla shows up and fights the Muto off screen. Okay, now what? The movie seems to really lose that build-up because it just feels like really strong sense of purpose and then desperately trying to get a grasp on what the rest of the movie is going to be about until we can finally get to the climax. Which is a problem because it leads to the first half being the best part of the movie, but the problem is that we're all here for Godzilla and he wasn't even introduced in that half yet. It's a really strange issue, and it just leads to a really bizarre sense of pacing. Because again, while the movie is overall really well paced and moving from one good scene to the next, it feels a little bit like the first half of the movie knew exactly what it wanted to be and how it wanted to approach the situation, and then once it got to the situation, it was struggling to kind of remold itself into something else, which is a monster fight movie. It's kind of reminiscent of another monster movie that had a similar sense of building up to one monster and then building up to another, which is the original Rodan. There's a lot of strange parallels to Rodan in that way, with really focusing hard on the humans and also building up to one monster first before the idea of Rodan is even introduced, with the Meganulas being introduced before Rodan and being the cause of a whole bunch of murders at the beginning of the movie, the ones that perpetuate the mystery of what's going on. Here's why it works in Rodan and doesn't work in Godzilla. In Rodan, that sense of building is completely different than what's happening in Godzilla. Now, the theory sounds the same. We introduce the human story. Okay. Then we introduce the monsters based on the human story. In the case of Rodan, we introduce the Megaguirus. Okay. Or Meganulas, rather. My apologies. And then we introduce the bigger monster. The Meganulas wake up, which then in turn wake up Rodan. Very similar to how the Muto wakes up Godzilla. Here's the difference, though. Once Rodan is introduced into the story, once the story shifts from, alright, we're telling this story about these insect monsters that are killing people in this mine, then to, oh my god, there's a way bigger thing that's eating these things that's going to wake up and kill everybody, Rodan takes center stage. There's a sense of build there. We go from human to small monster to big monster, and we focus on the big monster for the rest of the movie. It's this progressive build that gets us somewhere. In Godzilla, that idea is there, but it's different because we go from the human story to the smaller monster to the big monster, but then the big monster never takes center stage. It continues to be about the smaller monsters, with this big monster kind of being in and out in regards to being focused upon. It feels awkward. And the other thing is that the difference between a movie like this and a movie like Rodan is that Rodan was the first movie to feature Rodan. When the movie came out, nobody knew what Rodan was. So there's a different stigma attached to the movie not really being about Rodan for a while until he's finally introduced, and the movie not really being about Godzilla until he's introduced. Because this is a Godzilla movie. Godzilla is way more... Because this is also not like being the first Godzilla movie. Godzilla has had 29 movies before this, so there's a certain expectation of, we're waiting for Godzilla now. And that's different than watching a movie about a monster that you've never heard of, and it's just like, we're not waiting for Rodan, we're waiting to see what the movie is getting at, and then once we see Rodan, once we're invested in Rodan, the movie becomes about him. That's not what is happening in Godzilla at all. It's just a very unbalanced movie, which sucks because the first half was really, really balanced. Human story building into the monster story. It was perfect. The other difference between the first half and the second half is that the first half, again, has a very specific purpose and a really good sense of balancing all its different story components. The problem is, once that first half ends, once that purpose goes away, the movie again struggles to find a new one, and it leads to a really unbalanced story. Because the focus shifts all over the place as the movie tries to regain this new sense of purpose. It shifts from the military story, to Ford trying to get home to his family, to Dr. Serizawa, to Godzilla, to the MUTO'S, to all these different points, and it never really manages to balance them in a way where we can't have one without the other. Where the human story is happening because of the monsters. I mean, it is, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like the movie is just trying to retain, alright, we spent the first half focusing on the humans, so we've got to continue focusing on them. Yes, but not to the extent that the movie does. You have to do that in a good monster movie. Rodan doesn't stop being about the humans once Rodan shows up, neither does the original Gojira for that matter, which this movie is, for the most part, trying to retain the spirit of. But you have to balance it out, and the movie never really achieves that, which is ironic because the whole movie is about, well, achieving a natural balance, which is Godzilla. So it's funny that Godzilla is the thing that is never truly balanced with the rest of the movie. Very, very ironic. So again, good ideas here in the story, but not all of them are executed well. But some of them really, really are. The government conspiracy is a great idea for a Godzilla movie, and again, it gives the first half that really good sense of intrigue and purpose. Again, once all of that is lost, the story really, really suffers because it becomes about waiting for the action at that point, which is a problem that a lot of movies have. It's, alright, building the story, we're waiting for the action, then the action happens. So now the movie just becomes about waiting for the next action scene. There's a good way to balance it where you give enough action, you give enough story, and you can't have one without the other. Monster movies have achieved this. Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris is one of the best examples of this, of perfectly blending the action with the story. Godzilla desperately tries to get there, but never truly does. Gareth Edwards' whole mantra with making this movie was trying to get there, making you wait for the action so that way when you finally got it, you would truly, truly appreciate it. But it never quite achieves that in the best of ways. What we're left with is the best parts of the story ending, and then the action kind of happening, but then having to cut back to less interesting story points because Gareth Edwards wants to hold back on the action until the very, very end. It's frustrating and very disappointing because of how good the first half is. Again, not to say that the second half is bad and that the whole movie should just be a one long action scene after Godzilla is introduced. But no, you have to balance these things. The action needs to have a consequence and the story has to have a consequence on the action. And that is the biggest thing that the movie never gets right, is balancing those two aspects of it. It feels like the action and story are two separate things. The movie never truly masters that sense of impact one has on the other, which is frustrating. Now, the movie does try to achieve this sense of purpose that the first half had, with the first half building to the reveal of the monsters, so then the second half should be about building to the collision course of the three monsters. Now, from the get-go, the issue is that each monster isn't equally well developed. The male Muto is, bar none, the best developed, with that whole first half building to him. Godzilla? It's not so great. The build-up to seeing Godzilla is lengthy and that wait is strong. You're definitely rewarded for waiting with that epic introduction in Hawaii. But the problem is that the story just seems to end, and then the movie then for 15 minutes seems to be focused on introducing Godzilla, which is a lengthy bit of film time, but it's not as much as the male Muto got, and this is supposed to be Godzilla's movie. You really should have balanced the two monsters with building both monsters at the same time, because they're both going to appear at similar times. Here's how I would have fixed it if I was writing or editing this movie. I would have had Godzilla actually show up first. Because Godzilla fight movies in the past have been about introducing the new monster relative to Godzilla. Or at least the best ones have. The most generic Godzilla fight movies have been seemingly movies that could have been about the monster that Godzilla's fighting, and Godzilla just seems thrown in. Sadly, this comes closer to that than it does to the ideal monster fight movie, like say Godzilla vs. Biollante, where you can't have one monster without the other. And the story has to complement both monsters. But Godzilla at least gets some sense of build-up with that scene in the conference room then building to the scene in Hawaii. There is a slow progression there. Again, it's not as good as the MUTO, but it's good. Then we have the third end of this piece, which is the female MUTO, who does not get that same degree of development. Godzilla and the male MUTO have their first conflict in Hawaii, and then the movie then has to quickly introduce the female MUTO so we can start building on that collision course idea with building into the final fight. So it seems almost like a rehash, because then Zazubaar reveals this third spore, where it is, and that the male MUTO is heading towards her. The idea of another MUTO being around is introduced quickly, and then 2 seconds later, we just see it. And it just feels very, very reminiscent of the male MUTO, and it feels like a little bit of rehash, where you've got a bunch of military guys going into the nuclear, I'm going to call them vaults, at Yucca Mountains, seeing the light just like Zazubaar did in the beginning of the movie, and then seeing a giant hole in the mountain where the female MUTO came out. It attacks Las Vegas, and then they work out the whole rest of the story of the male MUTO coming to mate with the female. Again, it's fine, but it's not balanced. Again, the male MUTO got the best development, and then the other two monsters got lackluster development by comparison. The movie really needed, I think the movie needed another go-round at the script in order to hammer out the other two monsters getting equally good development to the male MUTO. Now again, I think this could have been solved by introducing Godzilla first, starting off the movie about him and then building into the other monsters through him. Maybe what they could have done is have the male MUTO talking to the female while they were still in their cocoons, waking up Godzilla, and Godzilla heading towards the Janjira power plant. Maybe Bryan Cranston starts to see the connections of all this monster stuff with all these, maybe these boats disappearing because Godzilla's waking up. So start the movie off about Godzilla and then introduce the other monsters through him. I think that would have been a much better way to handle it, because then it would have equal balance, because you're introducing both the male MUTO and Godzilla at the same time, and then you could also introduce the idea of the female MUTO through that as well. That hour-long build-up should have been focused on introducing all three monsters, and it's not. So I'm going to get off that point now, and also just say that I also think that the story should have been a little bit more about, in order to make the thing feel a little bit more like it had a sense of purpose, is make it more about people's reactions to the giant monsters. Which is what I think a lot of people wanted the movie to be about to begin with. The world reacting to Godzilla's return, or in this case, his introduction to the general public. The movie would have also been given a sense of uniqueness in that way, by having it be about people reacting to these giant atomic creatures from the dawn of time that they didn't know about because of a government cover-up. As it stands, the movie goes for a little bit more of a semi-routine disaster movie tone by just having a bunch of destruction and people trying to survive the disaster. I would have liked to see some more news reports about, oh my god, there are these giant monsters and here's what we know. There's a little bit of that in the special features on the Blu-ray with the very awesome special feature called the Godzilla Revelation, which is done as kind of like a YouTube video-esque guy in his computer talking about this conspiracy theory about Godzilla. And I wish a little bit more of that was in the movie, because it would have gone a long way to making the thing more interesting and a little bit less routine. And it also would have given it a better sense of purpose to make it about people reacting and then dealing with the aftermath of people reacting. It also would have solved some problems that I'm going to bring up in a little bit. But speaking of people's reactions and why it's a little bit of a problem that they don't have those reactions in the movie, let's get into the human cast. Now, part of the initial problem with the human cast relative to that problem I just mentioned earlier of the movie not being enough about the people's reaction to these giant monsters is the people that the movie decides to focus on as its human cast. Unfortunately, the movie picks a roster of characters who are trained to push their emotions aside and just deal with the situation as it stands, not lending to a movie that's actually about the people's reactions to the giant monsters, which is a really big problem since that's what a lot of people wanted to see from it, and I think that would have made for a more interesting movie. But that being said, let's get specifically into the human cast. First and foremost, the one that is one of the biggest proponents of this problem I just brought up, let's talk about Ford Brody. Ford Brody is one of the most controversial film protagonists I have seen in a very long time. A lot of people don't like the dude. Both the character and Aaron Taylor Johnson's performance as him have been criticized heavily by everybody, calling him boring, flat, lackluster, and outacted by every single other character in the movie. Now, I don't agree with this 100%. I think Aaron Taylor Johnson does fine given the material that he's given, and as most people have said, he's doing a pretty good job at characterizing a soldier, at least the ones I've met. He holds himself up straight, he has a very kind of humble, good-natured attitude about everything. You know, of course, he's got the things that piss him off, his relationship with his father being one of them. But overall, he's a pretty even-keeled type of character. And that's really good for a soldier. So you really can't give Aaron Taylor Johnson a lot of crap for that performance since it's accurate to who he's playing. Most of the problems lie with the script itself. And overall, by the virtue of focusing on a soldier. Now, interestingly, this is really the first Godzilla movie to feature a traditional soldier as the lead protagonist. Now, I know that sounds really bizarre given the franchise's tropes and history, but thinking back on the franchise's history, this is the first time we've got a traditional soldier in the driving seat of the film. Other Godzilla movies have featured military-type people as their protagonists, mainly pilots, but those have always been of giant mechs and not traditional on-the-ground soldiers. You know, Aoki in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 is the protagonist, but he's not a soldier. He's a robotics engineer who got roped into being a soldier because of shitty G-force politics. And that's probably the closest the franchise ever really got to having a traditional soldier as the protagonist. Actually, the biggest trope in Godzilla movie history in regards to its main human protagonist is the character being a reporter. It's a huge cliche for the series to do that, and more than half of them actually have reporters in as either the lead protagonist, like Maki in Godzilla 1985, or more classically, Sakai in Mothra vs. Godzilla. So, strangely enough, this is the first time to have a soldier as the lead protagonist. Now, again, seems like kind of an obvious thing to do, given the military being one of the forces that's going to interact the most with the monsters that the movie is also about. But I think this movie also demonstrates why doing that can be kind of a shot in the foot, and why none of the other Godzilla movies ever really did it. And the reason is because soldiers are trained to suppress their emotions when they're dealing with tense situations. Mainly when they're going to battle trying to save the world or their country or however you want to describe it. They're trained to suppress their emotions, put their feelings aside, and focus on the mission. So the reason why I think Ford is kind of flat in terms of his personality in regards to his emotional response to the situations in the film is, again, that he's a seasoned soldier who has been trained to do that. Especially since not only is he just a grunt, he's also a goddamn explosive ordnance disposal soldier. He's not just a typical guy on the ground with a gun. The dude takes apart live bombs for a living. So he, more than any other soldier, is going to be trained to keep his emotions back, handle stress, and focus on the situation at hand. So again, I think Aaron Taylor Johnson's performance is great in terms of capturing that and showing that, but the character himself in terms of being written is kind of a strange choice for an emotional lead because he's trained to suppress those emotions. So I don't so much think it's the fact that the character is bad and that the performance is bad. I just think that it was a strange choice in terms of putting the film together. Now, as a protagonist, I actually think he's pretty good. He does get some emotional weight in a couple of regards, but he's a good POV type of character. We get to learn a lot about realistically learn a lot about the universe and about the story through him without a lot of kind of clunky, shifting perspective, which is something that a lot of monster movies really attempt, is to give us one solid character to bunker down and get to know that we can then experience the craziness with. And Ford is a good character for that, and he achieves that purpose quite well, kind of bouncing all over the world as the monster situation is going on. Now, at points it gets a little bit ridiculous that the monsters are showing up where he happens to be, the most ridiculous of them being when he's in Honolulu going home, and the male MUTO just happens to show up at that airport, and that's where Godzilla happens to have his first fight with the male MUTO. It's really, really convenient. But all in all, good choice for a POV character that we're going to follow and learn about the story with. One of the other things that I really like about Ford is his relationship to the theme and to the story. It's one of the best things about the movie, and it's probably the best thing about Ford's character. I really like him becoming an EOD, because it's really, really subtle, and also really, really cool given the dude's backstory. Think about it. As a kid, his mother was killed in what he perceived as a nuclear meltdown. An earthquake causing an atomic reactor to go haywire and kill everybody in the building except for his father. It makes perfect sense for him to become an EOD. He wants to prevent that from happening to anybody else, and it might even give him a sense of control over his life that he didn't have when he was a kid. Being able to disarm those situations and prevent his life from being ruined. There's a great little moment in the beginning of the movie, right before Ford goes to Japan to bail his dad out of jail, when he's talking to Elle, and Elle reminds him that he should be a little bit more lenient on his father because he lost everything in the Janjira meltdown. But Ford reminds her, yeah, so did I, and I got over it. Now, she also says that he really didn't, given his current emotional reaction. But what Ford reminds us is that that incident still weighs heavily on his mind, and I think that him becoming an EOD was his own personal way of gaining control over it, and it feels like a natural progression of the story and of the characters, rather than kind of just a kitschy way to get a protagonist in the film that is both connected to this conspiracy and also connected to the military, so he'll be able to be involved in all the military operations against the monsters later on. It's a good, natural, interesting way to achieve all of that, and a really well-made decision and well-executed decision. Now, in regards to his relations to the theme of the film being that man has to stop fucking ourselves up by progressing our own destruction and just learn to fix our mistakes rather than covering them up and repeating them over and over again, which is not only the theme of the film, but also the theme of the entire goddamn franchise. I really like Ford's place in that, and it's one of the best aspects of the story as well, in regards to connecting the human story to the monster story. So, the personal story of Ford and his family is really well tied into the overarching theme that I just mentioned. Because Ford's whole character arc in the movie is learning from his father that you can't just bury everything in the past, forget about it, and move on. You've got to face the past and proactively try and fix it, rather than just continuously running away from it and trying to forget about it, which is what that whole scene in Joe Brody's house is about right before they go back to Janjira. Now, Ford's arc is cemented when he decides to finally give in to his father's request and go back with him to Janjira to try and figure out what was going on and warn the world that something really bad is about to go down there. And Ford going back to his own house is the embodiment of him facing his past and learning to come to grips with it. I love that moment where he picks up that little toy soldier and he carries it with him all the way to Hawaii. It's almost kind of like that's the thing that inspired him to be a soldier, and that it's now his connection to his past. Now, the other aspect that goes into this, aside from Ford fitting nicely into the theme of the story, is also that he also gets to learn something from his father that his father also learns, which I'll talk about in a minute when I get to Joe Brody, is that you can't take your family for granted. You have to spend every possible moment with them that you can, and you always have to put their safety above everything else. They are the most important thing in your world, which is something that both Ford and Joe kind of have in common, is that they both push their families aside a little bit for their jobs. Joe, in the prologue in 1999, Joe kind of ignores his son because he's on the phone with the power plant where he works, trying to warn them about this whole thing going on. Then Joe loses part of his family with Sandra dying, and later on he realizes that he should have spent as much time with them as possible and focused on keeping them safe rather than chasing after his own career and after anything else. They're the most important thing in a man's life. And Ford's in a little bit of a similar situation. Being in the Navy and being away for years at a time, going off into war and being stationed in places all over the world. Both men are pushing their families aside for seemingly good reasons, Joe trying to stop a nuclear meltdown, and Ford going off to protect his country, but at the same time, they're ignoring their families. And they both kind of learn that you have to put your family above everything else. Otherwise, you're going to lead to a regretful life where you didn't get to spend as much time with them as you could, and then you lose them. Kind of lends perspective in a way, and that's the thing that Ford takes away from his father, spending the rest of the movie trying to get back to his family. Which makes that moment at the end where all three of the Brody clan are reunited really, really touching. And a good way to cap off Ford's story. Now, while I like all of this, the problem is a couple different things. So, Ford's story kind of ends a little bit prematurely, at least in regards to his character development and his relation to the theme of the story. It still continues a little bit, but the point where it kind of dies is kind of the point where most of the interesting things about the story die, and that's after Joe Brody dies and after everything at Janjira is done. Once Joe dies, Ford's story with his father and Ford's character development of learning to face the past is completely over, and it becomes something else entirely about him trying to get back to his family and stop all this stuff with the monsters going on. Now again, it makes sense given the stuff that he learned from Joe. But the stuff that he was learning from his father completely stops halfway through the movie, and it feels like the rest of the movie is just more stuff with this character, and it feels like all the interesting stuff about him has been left behind, which is something that the movie loses a lot of. Now, I'm not really sure how you could fix this, except in the obvious way of not making Joe Brody die at Janjira, but we'll talk about that in a second. But I wish there would have been a way to prolong his character arc throughout the entire movie. Again, his story continues. His trying to get back to his family and protect them, which is what was his father's last words to his son. Keep them safe, whatever it takes. It just feels over a little bit too soon, and that the rest of the movie is just kind of the finality of his character arc just spread out over an hour. It's a little bit weird and a little bit poorly constructed. But again, I'm not really sure how you fix it given the movie that we have. The other thing in regards to this is that the dude just gets a little bit too much focus in regards to the wider story, regardless of how much I like what they do with him. We just cut back to him and what he's going through too much and too often. Again, I like the guy, but there's also a whole other spectrum of stuff going on around him. There's Godzilla's story, the MUTO'S story, the military story, Sarazawa's story, all this different stuff, and we keep cutting back to him and him trying to get back to his family. At a certain point, it becomes a little bit redundant. He gets somewhere, the monsters stop him from getting to his family, and then he has to go somewhere else and do something else. It gets a little bit repetitive, and there's so much more interesting stuff going on around him that I wish we could jump away from him for a little bit and go experience something else. Again, I know the monster movie monster movies should try and have that anchor point to kind of sit in the driver's seat with and experience everything through their eyes, but at a certain point, it doesn't. Ford stops giving any real interesting things in regards to the story and the perspective that he's seeing, and it becomes a little bit repeating everything that we've seen and done before this. So I wish they would have found a way to kind of move away from him or find ways to kind of take him into different places so that way we can see a little bit more of what's going on and that it's not just him in the same situation over and over again. So he's a little bit too simplistic to get about as much focus as he does, which kind of sucks. But overall, I like Ford. And I think that he gets a little bit too much hate in regards to both Aaron Taylor Johnson's performance, his character arc, and his place in the theme. But I do agree that he has way too much screen time, and that the movie should have been written differently to make him a little bit more of a match for the emotional reaction to the monsters that the movie should have been about. So I agree with that completely, but I still like the guy. Now, I also want to briefly mention Ford's family, mainly Elle and his son Sam, because the movie kind of becomes about them a little bit indirectly, where they're not the primary focus in regards to their perspectives, though they both get scenes of being the primary focus. But the ultimate goal of Ford's story is to get back to them. Now, I like Elle and Sam. There's a good scene at the beginning where Ford comes home and spends that time with his family, and we get to see that they've got a good family dynamic. He and Elle, Aaron Taylor Johnson, and Elizabeth Olsen have a good husband-wife kind of dynamic, which is completely awkward given the roles that they're both going to have in the next Avengers movie. But for this movie, it works really well. And I like them as a couple, and you do definitely get invested in the story of Ford getting to see her again. So they're likable enough, but the problem is, again, that they're just too focused on in regards to the goals of the story. It just feels very, very small and kind of boring for them to be so important to the overall goals of the film that we're kind of losing a lot of the other really interesting stuff going on. It's kind of the same thing I had with Ford, where he's good, but there's so much other more interesting stuff going on around him that you kind of resent them a little bit because of how much focus they get. The other thing is, the other reason why you don't really like how much focus they get is that they don't really do anything for the story itself except for give Ford something to go back to. And also, every now and then to get a little bit more of the perspective of what's going on with the monsters. We cut to Elle Brody when the male Muto first lands in San Francisco, and when Godzilla first gets in San Francisco and has his fight with the male Muto. And of course, there's also the scene on the Golden Gate Bridge where Sam Brody is on a bus going to an evac point, and Godzilla attacks the Golden Gate Bridge. But just to cap off on them, they get too much focus in the story to be as kind of boring as they are. They don't really get any specific characterization like Ford does. Elle is just kind of a wife and a nurse, and Sam is just kind of a little kid. We don't get enough specifically about them to make us truly care about them, except for their relationship to Ford. So they should have been a little bit more well-developed given how much of the story is about them. And they don't get a ton of screen time, but they do get enough where they're a little bit too boring for that. I almost wish that, to give her more of a place in the story, they would have made Elle a reporter, because that would have given us another perspective in order to find out more about what's going on with the monsters. Because then we wouldn't have this problem with Ford of not having enough of an emotional response to the monsters, because maybe we could have gotten it through Elle, her running around San Francisco interviewing people, trying to figure out what's going on. That would have also given her a little bit better of a reason to stay in the city. I know she's being noble by staying at her nursing post to help people who are caught in the monster attack, but it would have been better for learning about the overall situation if she would have been a reporter finding out what was going on. I know that's me rewriting the movie, and that's not really fair. And it also would have kind of gone back to that trope of Godzilla movies focusing on reporters, but I think it would have been better than the situation that we're left with. But what we're left with is still fine, just a little bit too typical and a little bit underdeveloped. But getting into characters who aren't underdeveloped, let's talk about Joe Brody, another one of the most controversial characters in recent film history. Joe Brody, of course, played by Bryan Cranston, is one of the best things about the movie, bar none. And almost anybody who you ask about the film will say that Joe Brody is the best part of the movie. He is the best developed character. Bryan Cranston is amazing as always, and I'm super pissed that he died. Fuck this movie. It's shit. That's what most people will tell you. I agree with about 75% of that. Bryan Cranston is brilliant, of course. He always is. He's a master actor. He's kind of got the world as his oyster lately in regard to everybody loving him because, of course, he was Walter White on Breaking Bad. He was Hal on Malcolm in the Middle. He was the voice of several monsters on Power Rangers, but I don't think that's the reason why he's become such a master, such a well-loved actor. But anyway, I also agree that Joe Brody is the most well-rounded, well-developed, and best performed of all the characters in the movie. Losing Sandra is a really powerful scene, and a scene that, I swear to God, every time I see it, makes me tear up. Regardless of how many times I see the movie and that I know it's coming. Every time I watch Joe standing at that door as the radiation comes careening towards him, and that scene where he looks at his wife in the window as the doors close, it gets me going every time. Hell, it made Quentin Tarantino cry, so if I want to cry, I'll cry, damn it. And we really come to feel for Joe, and the kind of the guilt and the self-pity that he inflicts upon himself because of how he lost his wife. One of the biggest things about his character is that Joe completely blames himself for everything that happened to Sandra, and a lot of what happened with Ford in regards to their poor relationship. In the prologue, after he ignores his son while he's on the phone with the Janjira Power Company, Sandra is trying to have a little bit of a personal conversation with him about his birthday, but Joe is very quickly to push the problem of what's going on with the reactor, and immediately says, don't even come up to the crow's nest, just go right down to the reactor and see what's going on. Joe sent her down there, and because of that decision, she's dead. And Joe completely blames himself for that. And it's part of the reason why he spends so much time and energy trying to figure out what happened, because he blames himself. He's trying to find redemption for what he did, for sending his wife down there, for, in his eyes, basically killing his wife. And it really gives him this very tragic, very human, very relatable personality, and also his story. We really come to love Joe, and we come to love following Joe, kind of as Ford being our avatar for that, following Joe around and seeing how he connects back to all the monster stuff. The other thing is that Joe, probably only second to Dr. Serizawa, is the biggest character in the movie pushing the main message of the whole Godzilla franchise and the overarching theme of the film. Again, it goes back to what I said with Ford, the whole whatever it takes thing. In that scene in his house before he and Ford go back to Janjira to figure out what's going on, he says that he's going to find out what happened and end this thing, whatever it takes. Now, Joe's whole story is about two things, and they're both kind of related to what I already said with Ford, so I'll be about as brief as I can. Joe's story is about both teaching his son to not make the same mistakes that he did, mainly taking his family for granted for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but the other thing, in kind of a weird, indirect way, teaching the rest of the world to do the same, to face the mistakes that you made in the past and fix them. You can't just cover up what happened in the past, run away and try and move on, because you are doomed to make the same mistakes in the future. That's why he is so devout on figuring out what happened at Janjira, never giving up, no matter how much pain it causes him, no matter how worse it makes the relationship with his son, and no matter how many times he gets thrown in jail. He's never going to give up. He will always try and figure out what happened, find the truth, and fix it. Because just covering it up and just running away and trying to move on and pretend like nothing weird ever happened, again, it's going to continue to happen. That is the point of Godzilla. Godzilla is nature's representation of the mistakes that man made in both World War II and the Cold War. Godzilla will never truly die because nature keeps throwing him up saying, hey guys, stop fucking around with nuclear weapons because you're only going to destroy yourselves. And that's basically the point of Joe's story. Not necessarily the point of not fucking around with nukes, but of stopping consistently making the same mistakes that you made in the past over and over again, and doing whatever you have to do to fix those mistakes. I really love Joe's story in that way, and Bryan Cranston hammers all of these points home with his incredibly emotive, varied performance that can go from being funny to heartfelt to emotional, all these points. The dude just never ceases to amaze me at just how fucking good he is. He's always so good at being an everyman to me. That's how Walter White is portrayed in Breaking Bad, why he's such a great character. And a lot of that kind of translates into Joe Brody. And not that I'm saying that Joe Brody is a ripoff of Walter White and that Bryan Cranston was just put in this movie as a marketing thing to get Breaking Bad fans to go see this movie. I think there was a little bit of that going on with that second trailer, but I'm not going to hammer that point home because I don't really agree with it. But no matter what the reason was, marketing or otherwise, it really helps the movie and really enhances that first half and makes it as good as it is. Again, I've said that that's the best part of the movie is from a story perspective, and I think he's a lot of the reason why. He's just so great to follow. Now, the other thing is that, and the reason why this movie is so controversial in regards to having been kind of advertised to people who love Bryan Cranston, is that he dies very, very early on and doesn't get a lot of screen time. So strangely enough, the two big things that everybody wanted to see from the movie, Bryan Cranston and Godzilla, are probably the two least things that it gives you, which is kind of funny. But anyway, so there's a lot to say in regards to Joe Brody's death. There's a lot of good, a lot of bad. Good. His death is really, really powerful, and a lot of that is that we kind of feel it with Ford that we're losing this guy that we've been getting to know for the past part of this movie, and also Ford is losing his father, and we've also come to like Ford, so his death definitely feels very, very emotional. The problem is that it also feels a little bit forced, because the reasons that he is killed off so early, as said by Gareth Edwards, is that they couldn't really figure out anything to do with him past that point. A lot of the purpose of him in the story is his exposing the truth at what happened at Janjira. So once that's been done, once the MUTO is out, and once the destruction stuff is beginning, and the government conspiracy stuff is kind of ended, he kind of becomes a little bit superfluous in regards to the overall story. Now, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there are a million things you could have done with him that would have made him even more interesting than he already is, and also continued him throughout the entire movie, one of them being making him the protagonist of the thing, which would have been pretty fucking cool. But, regardless of that, I don't think his death was necessary, and the other thing is that, as emotional as it is, and as great as that final scene is, where he's up in the helicopter with Ford, and he imparts those dying words onto his son of "keep your family safe, whatever it takes," his death still feels a little bit off to me, and a little bit forced, and almost just like the movie is kind of just like, oh, you like this character? You like this character? Bah! Killing him. Kind of like Game of Thrones in that way. So that also is very, very is a little bit frustrating. And I wish that his death could have either been a little bit more subtly done in regards to why he was killed off, and also in regards to how he's killed off. His death is just a little bit too... His death isn't enough given the character that he has in the movie. He just kind of falls off a bridge, and that's kind of sad. I do like that the male MUTO is the thing that kills him. That kind of gives him that connection to his wife, but it is a little bit off. The other thing is that he kind of dies without getting any closure for his character, and without being given enough time to have a true emotional response to the monsters. As soon as he finds out that this whole situation was caused by the existence of giant monsters, he just dies, and we never get to learn how he feels about that, and how exactly he perceives this whole situation. How angry is he at Monarch for covering the whole goddamn thing up, and also, how does he feel about the existence of giant monsters? They kill him before any of that is even brought to the forefront. Now, this will also bring me into another problem that I have with his character, though it's more of a plot problem than it is necessarily a problem with his character, but it is certainly an issue. So, throughout the entire beginning of the movie, Ford is calling his dad crazy, and every character we interact with prior to meeting Joe perceives him as being crazy and kind of kooky and kind of a crazy conspiracy theorist for what happened to his wife and what exactly is going on at Janjira. And Ford also mentions that this is another one of his crazy kookpot theories, which is why he got arrested in Janjira. Now, the problem is that we never truly get a definitive theory by Joe Brody as to what exactly he thinks happened at Janjira. He thinks it was a military mistake, thinking it was a design flaw they were covering up, but we never get the details of what exactly are these crackpot theories that he's suggesting. I guess the whole reason why Ford thinks he's crazy is because he thinks that something not on the level happened aside from the earthquake causing the nuclear meltdown, but we don't get enough of what exactly are these crackpot theories that he's posing. Mainly, we never truly get an answer for how much he knows about Monarch and how much he knows about the cover-up, and does the dude theorize that giant monsters are involved in what's going on? And the biggest scene that makes it confusing as to how much Joe Brody knows is that that very now kind of iconic monologue he gives to Dr. Serizawa and the Monarch people interrogating him, which was the kind of promo audio for the official main trailer and kind of the crux of the main trailer. The whole thing about you have no idea what's coming, it's going to send us back to the Stone Age, this was not an earthquake, it wasn't a typhoon, all that good stuff. It was an amazing way to advertise the movie. In the movie, it's a little strange, because the trailer for the movie seemed to imply that he was talking about Godzilla. That you have no idea what's coming was referring to Godzilla waking up. It's going to send us back to the Stone Age, referring to the destruction Godzilla was going to cause. That's not what's going on at all, or at least I don't think so. What he seems to be talking about, given the context of what's going on in the scene, is that Joe is talking about the EMP that's being caused by the cocoon that the MUTO is encased in, and it feeding on the radiation. That's what caused everything back in 1999. That this is all building to another massive EMP, and that this is all building to the creature waking up. Now, it doesn't really lessen the coolness factor of that monologue, although it still would have been cooler if it was about Godzilla, but that monologue is still great, and it does, for the most part, make sense in regard to the EMP. But it still feels odd because we're just not sure how much he knows about what's going on, about Monarch, and about what exactly is going on, and about what's going on with the whole cover-up situation. And my other big question is, does he know about Godzilla? Not necessarily does he know that Godzilla exists, but does he theorize that a similar cover-up happened in 1954 that happened in 1999? Now, it would seemingly be yes, because there's a newspaper article on his wall about the supposed cover-up of the Bikini Atoll test in 1954. Now again, it lends the question of, does he think there's something going on with monsters? Is he reading any reports about a giant monster appearing in 1954, and about what happened in the Philippines? Again, we just don't learn enough about what he thinks is going on, and how much he knows about the monsters and about the whole situation. And again, I wish that he wouldn't have died before he would have gotten an opportunity to both react to the monsters, and also he wouldn't have died before he could have gotten a proper dialogue scene with Dr. Serizawa. Because they really would have had the most interesting dynamic in the film. Because Serizawa is the main one covering up everything going on with the MUTO, and Joe is the one trying to remove the curtain from this cover-up, and also what they're covering up is the thing that killed his wife. I want to know how he feels about Serizawa. Does he hate him? Does he respect him? How would he feel for Serizawa? But speaking of the good doctor, let's get into Dr. Serizawa himself, because I have a ton to say. Now, Serizawa is my personal favorite character in the movie. Now, part of that, of course, is his namesake, but the other thing is that I find him infinitely fascinating as a character, but really tragically underdeveloped. And the reason why he's my favorite character is because he's the biggest proponent of the theme of Godzilla, and the biggest connection to Godzilla in the film in regards to the human cast. He's the one who knows everything about Godzilla. He's the expert on paleontology and on Godzilla. He knows everything that's going on with the MUTO'S and Godzilla. And he's got a really interesting perspective on the monsters and what they mean. The dude is the biggest proponent of the classic theme of Godzilla, in regards to man being arrogant about how much they control over nature, and nature occasionally having to remind us of how much control we actually have over it. That being represented, of course, by Godzilla. Serizawa sees Godzilla as this godlike entity, that it's nature, that he is nature's embodiment of control, of keeping the orders of nature preserved. That there's an order that nature has that has to be maintained. That whenever that order is disrupted, that Godzilla wakes up to set it back into place. Now, we'll get into how I feel about that being Godzilla's characterization later, but Serizawa feeling that way about it is really, really interesting. It kind of gives him this almost romantic view of Godzilla. He seems to have this very naturalistic view on the world, this love of nature, this inherent fascination with it, and this almost religious viewpoint on the Big G, which is really, really cool. But the problem is that all these feelings that the dude has for Godzilla are kind of left ambiguous or just not in this particular movie. Now, I said that Dr. Serizawa is tragically underdeveloped, and that's mostly in the case of the movie, which of course is the only thing that we can really use to develop the character. However, in regards to expanding out the canon, Godzilla Awakening, the prequel graphic novel to this movie, which I've already reviewed, so if you want to see my thoughts on that, go and watch that review. The best and most important thing that it does is flesh out the history of Dr. Serizawa and give us his backstory, mainly by telling the story of his father, who was one of the first people to work for Monarch, and also the man who discovered Godzilla, which gives Dr. Ishiro Serizawa a very interesting connection to Godzilla. Because he might equate Godzilla with his father and have almost this nostalgia for him, and almost see him as this benevolent force regardless of the destruction that he's going to cause. So, he's really interesting in that way, but in the film itself, he doesn't really give an explanation for why he both loves Godzilla so much, why he finds him so fascinating, and why exactly he has this viewpoint on him that he does. He just doesn't get enough of his backstory in the movie. Now, this all comes down to Serizawa not being the thing that the movie is focusing on, much like Godzilla in that regard. He doesn't get enough screen time, and more importantly, the dude does not get enough dialogue. Ken Watanabe and the movie have kind of been criticized for basically just putting him in there to stop and stare dramatically at things, which I kind of agree with, but what it leads to is that his character is just way too mysterious, which can be good. The namesake of his character was also mysterious in the original Godzilla, not knowing much about him until way later on in the movie, and the mystery lending to his tragedy and also to the nature of his character, given that he's very personal, very much so in his head, and holding this big, huge, devastating secret. And Ishiro Serizawa in this movie is kind of similar in that he too is holding all these big, world-ending secrets in his head with Godzilla, the MUTO'S, all these other devastating monsters that could be out there. But the issue is that we just don't get to learn enough about him, and the guy does not get enough dialogue. Too much of his dialogue is specifically there for exposition and not enough about how he feels about situations. Mostly just in his facial expressions, which is fine, but there's just too much of it. Facial expressions representing a character's emotions are fine, but there has to be a certain point where those facial expressions are given some sort of thing to explain them, and we never truly get that. There are a bunch of individual strands in the film that could have tied his character together and truly made him super interesting, but sadly they just never really do. And the other thing is that because of how mysterious he is and because of how little dialogue he gets, I'm also not sure how exactly we're supposed to view Dr. Serizawa as a character. Mainly, are we supposed to see him as morally right just because he doesn't think we should use the nuclear weapons against the monsters and should just let nature take hold and let Godzilla kill the MUTO'S? Or should we see him as morally ambiguous because he's covering up all this information about the MUTO'S and not giving the public information about all these devastating monsters? I'm just not sure about how we should feel about all that. And again, it's just all because he doesn't get enough dialogue and he doesn't get enough of a strong characterization or a character arc. We just don't get to see him go through any significant change. Or at least, I don't think we do. It's a little bit unclear, mainly in his, honestly, most famous line in the movie, or his most famous speech, when he's talking to Admiral Stantz later on in the film, and he gives that famous line now about, the arrogance of man is thinking that nature is in our control, and not the other way around. Let them fight. That awesome, awesome series of lines, and ultimately the thing that sums up Godzilla, is really, really fantastic, but the delivery is a bit strange, because I'm not sure if this is a realization for him, or if this is something that the dude already knew and is now imparting onto Admiral Stance and thus the rest of the world. I'm not sure if he went through a character arc based on all the people who died in the MUTO'S escape from Janjira and all the people that have died afterwards and Godzilla waking up, if he's realizing now that man has to stop trying to contain nature, because that's what he tried to do with the MUTO, also being the one to give the order to initially kill it in Janjira. And then based on the events that go throughout the entire movie, is he then learning that we have to step away and let nature take course, or is this something that the dude already knew? I'm not sure, because he also said something similar when he introduced the idea of Godzilla earlier in the movie, when he told us what Godzilla is, being nature's agent of balance. I'm just not sure how he feels about everything, and whether or not his speech towards the end of the movie is a character arc and realization, or if that's something he already knew and he just doesn't need a character arc because he's imparting lessons onto the rest of the world. I'm just not sure. I wish it was a character arc because it would make him more interesting, and also make him a little bit closer to his namesake in the original movie. Since Dr. Serizawa in that film was mastering this dangerous weapon that he didn't want to reveal to the rest of the world, but was forced to in order to deal with the reality of Godzilla, but then dying with it because he thought it was too dangerous to give to the rest of the world, and that it would just lead to another arms race. I think there could have been ways to make Serizawa's character arc in this mirror that, and also just make his character more interesting, by realizing how much power nature has and how little control man truly has, and how much we have to realize that and accept that, otherwise we're going to destroy ourselves. Again, his character is good, but just underdeveloped. And Ken Watanabe's performance is also excellent. He feels very, very kind of worn down and kind of earthly, and very, very intellectual, and also, every time you look at his face, it always looks like there's something going on behind it, mostly shock. But overall, his performance is just a little bit too cold and a little bit too distant for the character that we're given in the movie. Again, it makes sense, but there's never a moment where we get to learn enough about him. Throughout the entire movie, he's just stopping and staring, and ominously delivering lines about the monsters. Again, his performance is good for that. He's a very, very dramatic actor, but I just feel like the character, he's never really given a chance to just kind of come out of his shell and show us who he really is. He almost seems like he's got a wall around himself the entire movie, which would be fine if it was intentional and if it was brought up. This is kind of a similar situation to Ford, that we just don't get enough of an emotional reaction from him in the movie in regards to dialogue and his feelings about the situation. Again, it all could have worked if it would have been intentional and if it would have been brought up. The closest thing he gets to an emotional response is the scene that gives his real backstory in the movie. And it's one of the best scenes in the movie because it's a really great acting moment, and also a really good moment in terms of making reference to original Godzilla lore. And I'm, of course, referring to the scene where he tells Admiral Stance that his father was in the blast at Hiroshima, and that he has this watch, which is held off on the time when the bomb exploded. It gives him a really interesting connection to nuclear power and to nuclear warfare. And it does make his feelings about nature make sense. He doesn't like atomic weapons. That makes perfect sense. And what I also like about this is it also gives him a realistic reason to study the MUTO'S, because they're creatures that adapt to atomic radiation and feed on it, using it as a power source. Now, the reason why he would be interested in this is because it could also lead to humanity finding a way to be able to survive nuclear blasts, and also use that power in a way where, for good, where it's just there to give us power and it can't be used as a weapon. The problem is that this scene isn't given enough weight, and also his backstory not given enough weight. Once it's mentioned, it's never brought up again. And I'm just not really sure what exactly we're supposed to take away from it. Again, he's just too mysterious. Because he shows Admiral Stance this watch, tells him it belonged to his father, and then he walks away, and Admiral Stance is just left to kind of lament that. Again, it's a great moment between them, but I'm not sure what we're supposed to take away from it. And it's easily Ken Watanabe's best scene acting-wise, probably right next to the scene where he gives the backstory about Godzilla, but it's certainly his best character moment. And overall, the mentioning of Hiroshima in regards to his character just comes off a little bit too much to me like a cute nod to Godzilla lore and to actual history of atomic weapons and to the production history of Godzilla, being an entire response to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, rather than being an integral part of his character and the story. Again, I think it could have been. I think there's a lot of potential here for him having a fantastic, solid character arc, and also a fantastic connection to Ford and Joe Brody because of his tragic connection to atomic weapons, both having lost family members, supposedly. Now, this also brings me into a major plot hole in regards to this both supposedly being in canon with Godzilla Awakening, and also in regards to the character's age in this movie. Here are my problems as they stand. So, let's take the movie on its own merits for a second in this scene. Now, it's never explicitly stated in this movie that Serizawa's father died in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though that scene certainly implies that he's dead, given that he's the one who now has this watch, and that he holds it with such reverence, kind of reminding him of his father. The major implication here is that Serizawa's dad died in Hiroshima. But which would have been great, and also again would have given him a great connection to both Ford and Joe Brody. Now, the continuity problem that this has with Awakening is that, obviously, Serizawa's dad didn't die in the bombing of Hiroshima, though he was certainly there. But the problem is that that would mean, both in this movie and also as it's presented in Godzilla Awakening, that the dude would have had to have been born in either 1945 specifically, or a little bit before 1945, or maybe a little bit after if, his father had died in Hiroshima, but his mother survived and he was born a little bit afterwards. And here's why that's a problem. There is no way that Dr. Serizawa is 69 years old in this movie. Ken Watanabe sure as hell ain't that old. The dude's exactly the same age as my dad. He was born in 1959. And they didn't age him up in any way with makeup to make him look like he was 69 or 70, like his character would have to be if either his dad was dead in 1945, being killed in Hiroshima, or even if this was in continuity with Awakening, which I don't really think it is, because there's a lot of other continuity problems with Godzilla Awakening in that way that I won't get into because it's not really important to the movie. But either way, it does not make any fucking sense that that dude is 70 years old. Again, they should have either gotten an older actor, or just given him some makeup to make him look older, or just specifically say that his father survived the Hiroshima bombing and that he was born afterwards, which still could have given him a good connection to Godzilla, a connection to Hiroshima because his parents would have survived the bombing. His mother died in the book, which would still give him that connection, and also keep him connected to everything that happened in 1954 with Godzilla. So it all still could have worked and kept him to be a realistic age given how old the actor is. Now, here's the other thing, in regards to both the mentioning of Hiroshima and to the character's name. So, like the bombing of Hiroshima being mentioned and kind of just being a cute nod, Ken Watanabe's character being named Serizawa comes off a little bit too much like just a cute reference rather than this being a rebooted version of that character. Now, let me just say, I'm not going to get all bent out of shape because they named the guy Serizawa and he really isn't anything like the character in the original Gojira, except for a couple of coincidences like him having all these secrets bubbling around in his head, him being so mysterious. Again, that's cool, but in regards to his characterization and in regards to his personal history and the purpose he has in the film, he's really nothing like Dr. Serizawa. In this movie, he's a paleontologist who, based on the special features in the Blu-ray, proposed a theory that some prehistoric creatures survived several mass extinctions and buried themselves in the bottom of the ocean where they could get radiation, since the world that they would have lived on would have been more radioactive than the modern world, and that because of man's entering into the atomic age, that these creatures would reawaken and cause destruction, and that he studies these creatures. Fine, that's cool. But the problem is that it's really nothing like Dr. Serizawa. Now here's the thing. Again, I'm so thrilled that they even thought to name one of the characters in their movie after a classic Godzilla character. It's a really cool reference, and again, it shows that these guys know Godzilla. But the thing is that it would have made a lot more sense if they would have called him Yamane, and if this would have been a modern reinterpretation of Dr. Yamane, because almost everything I just mentioned is exactly what Dr. Yamane was in the original Gojira. He was a paleontologist. He proposed the theory that Godzilla survived an extinction event by burrowing to the bottom of the sea, and that atomic weapons woke him up. More importantly, Dr. Yamane's perceptions of Godzilla are almost the same as Dr. Serizawa's perceptions of Godzilla in this movie. He doesn't want the military to kill him, and he sees him as this positive force. Yamane wants to study Godzilla. He doesn't want to kill him, and the reason why he wants to study him is because he was able to survive an H-bomb blast, which is the same reason why Serizawa wants to study the MUTO'S. And overall, Ken Watanabe's performance is kind of this closed, emotionally closed anyway, very emotive performance. Is closer to Takashi Shimura's performance as Dr. Yamane in the original Godzilla. And of course, this would also fix the thing of his age. Dr. Yamane is supposed to be around 70 in the original Gojira, and that's what Dr. Serizawa would have to be in this movie, given all the stuff I just mentioned. So it also would have made sense if they would have called him Yamane in that way. But at the end of the day, they went with Dr. Serizawa because he's more well-known as a human Godzilla character, arguably the most well-known of any Godzilla character. And just the fact that they decided to do that is good enough for me, and I think that that's cool. So overall, Dr. Serizawa is good, but he needed a more well-defined character arc, more dialogue, and a clearer backstory. But overall, I like him. Now, I've spent a lot of time on the human cast, so I kind of want to start moving on. But in regards to the rest of the cast, they're good, but not great. The stands out being Dr. Graham, Dr. Serizawa's assistant, and of course Admiral Stantz, who are both well-acted, likable, and have a good place in the story. Graham serves to be kind of Dr. Serizawa's translator, not because he's speaking Japanese, but because the scientific exposition that he gives out is kind of very, very not suitable for laymen. So Graham kind of sees fit to explain some of the things that he's saying, and kind of stands to translate some of the technobabble-esque things that he says. She's also got kind of an interesting relationship with Serizawa. She calls him sensei, meaning that he would be her mentor in regards to teaching her about all this stuff about atomic age monsters and all this stuff. I wish their relationship was a little bit more well fleshed out, but it's still good, and I like that it was there, though I wish her character was given a little bit more depth. Admiral Stantz is a great character. He's very, very unique as a military leader because he's not an idiot and he's not an asshole. He's extremely level-headed and extremely focused on keeping people safe. That's the only purpose that he has. He just wants to protect his country, and he's not about purveying this government cover-up, although that is certainly one of his goals in one of his scenes early on. But once shit gets real, once people start dying, he's like, we're gonna save people's lives, I'm protecting my country, screw the cover-ups, screw everything else, I'm just about protecting people. But the other big thing is that, aside from the fact that he does try and make the nuke plan work, he isn't crazy about doing it. He's not crazy about launching a nuclear weapon, but he doesn't have any fucking choice. It's the only plan that they have to deal with the monsters so far that makes any sense and has any chance of working. So I really like that about that character, and I'm really glad that they gave the military a characterization in this movie that's very realistic, very kind of humble, and very focused on trying to save the world rather than being a shadowy asshole organization just out for their own needs. I really like that, and Stantz is awesome in that way. The acting and characterization of the rest of the cast kind of vary. Some of them are fine, some of them are annoying. But overall, the cast is really, really strong. The characters have a lot of promise for being very, very interesting and good points of view to follow in a Godzilla story. But the problem is that a lot of them are kind of underdeveloped, mainly Serizawa and Ford. And the movie never truly balances out their relationships in regards to the monsters. And speaking of the monsters, I think it's about time that we finally got into them in this story and how exactly they all match in with everything and how they hold up. Now, as I've done in the past in this series, I'm going to start off with the new monsters first, and then we'll get into the big G. So let's, of course, start off with the MUTO'S, the movie's own original monsters, and not, of course, Toho monsters. This is their first appearance. And both how they work in this movie on their own, and of course, we'll also compare them to both Godzilla himself and also to the greater lexicon of Godzilla movies and how they hold up. But overall, I actually really, really like the MUTO'S. I know a lot of people don't, and I'll get into why a lot of people don't and why I think they've got problems later on. But overall, I think they've got really, really good, creepy designs. And if you read the book that was the production booklet for this movie, Godzilla, the Art of Destruction, you'll see that they put a lot of time and consideration into putting these monsters together, both as creatures that could exist in the natural world, how they would look the coolest, and also how they would look the best in regards to this being a Godzilla movie, and also their relationship to Godzilla and making them make sense with all those different elements. So a lot of care was put into building these monsters and in regards to how they look and how they behave, and it really, really shows, and they really, really pay off for it. Despite not having a real face, the MUTO'S are extremely expressive and have a lot of personality. Really important for a Godzilla movie because that's something that's always been very important in having the monsters stand out from just being generic, big, mean forces of nature that don't have any personality. Each Godzilla monster has its own personality, and the MUTO'S are no different. They have this very interesting characterization that, I know I've been comparing this movie a lot to Rodan, but the MUTO'S kind of function in a very similar way to how the Rodans functioned in that movie. They're not presented as evil, just lost in time. Their only goal is to meet up with each other and just fight for their own personal survival. That's one of the things that I really like about the monsters in this movie, is that their story, and also the humans, is that they're all just trying to survive in this world. None of them have any malice in regards to each other specifically, though maybe the humans don't necessarily fit that, but the MUTO'S don't want to really destroy anything. They just need to survive. They're the only two left of their species, and they're not meant to be in this world. They're strangely tragic in that way, like the Rodans were in the first Rodan movie. And their only goal is to prolong their species, to procreate, to continue their legacy, which is all animals' goal in life, is to find a mate, to find somebody to connect with, and to procreate, to prolong your species. And I really like that that is both the goal of the MUTO'S, their characterization, and also the overall monster plot of the movies, is that we have to stop the MUTO'S from reproducing, because if they do, they're going to take over the world and destroy it, and that's what Godzilla's trying to do. But it makes the MUTO'S sympathetic. We feel for them. We feel for their plight, but we also see the destruction that they cause, and ultimately that they just don't fit in this world. The world has evolved past them. Now, to get back to the designs, again, I really like them, but they're not terribly original. Multi-armed insect-like monsters have ruled movies for the past 2 decades, like the Cloverfield monster, of course, the monsters in the Mist, and, of course, the bugs in Starship Troopers. But, in my opinion, they do enough to stand out from all those other creatures, and enough to make a true impression. I love all the red and the gray that goes into their design. Again, it's kind of a stereotype of modern-day monsters, to just kind of give them kind of just black, smooth, kind of insect-like looks to make them look really horrific. But it works for the MUTO'S, and it gives them a very kind of almost elegant, alien-looking feel. They look different from Godzilla in a good way. They're a completely different quadrant of monsters. Gareth Edwards pitched them in one of the documentaries on the Blu-ray as kind of being the UFOs of giant monsters, being mysterious, being sleek, being creepy. And we don't really know much about them, which is why they're called the MUTO'S, the massive unidentified terrestrial organisms, which is cool. In regards also to comparing them to UFOs, one of the coolest things about their design is their eyes, and also their claws. They both glow red. The eyes glowing red, of course, just all the time, and that expresses their emotions, what they're doing, and also when they're intaking radiation, as well as the claws. The claws glow red both when they're feeding on radiation, but also when they're about to charge up their EMP attacks, which both MUTO'S have. They glow red, and then they slam them to the ground in order to produce an EMP strike, which knocks out all the planes in the area. I'll get back to the EMP in a couple seconds. But their designs lend really well to a true scary monster movie. Which is funny because not all Godzilla movies, in fact, most Godzilla movies don't fight hard for that kind of horrific tone. And it's good to see them kind of go back to that with this movie. The MUTO'S are really, really scary. There's a couple of moments that are really, really pulse-poundingly tense, especially the scene in the train attack when the female MUTO attacks the train carrying the 2 nukes to San Francisco. And there's that great scene where the soldiers are investigating a bridge to see if it's able to support the train. They say it's good to go, and then the female MUTO attacks, being hidden in the background. There's a great shot where you see Ford and Sergeant Morales in the foreground, and you just see the hump of the female MUTO come up behind the mountain and head towards them. And also you mistake one of the claws of the MUTO for a tree, which then kills a couple soldiers. In that scene where the female MUTO looks for Ford and Morales and goes around the train about to kill them and circles around the tracks, and you see it move around slowly. It's a great tense sequence until finally the MUTO is then attracted to the train to get the nuke. So I really like the MUTO'S in that way because they function so well as creepy monsters. And adding into that is their roars. I love their roars. They're very, very high-pitched and they sound very much like insect clicks. Again, which doesn't necessarily sound terribly original, but it works for their kind of creepy vibe. And they also have a wide range of vocalizations for both when they're trying to terrify the humans, when they're trying to intimidate Godzilla, and also when they're trying to court each other, when they both meet up with each other in San Francisco. And there's that great scene where the male MUTO rises on a building and the female MUTO comes out of smoke and they both embrace. It's a great, great scene. I also really like the decision to make them creatures that feed on radiation as a food and energy source, which they can then weaponize as the EMP. It's a good way to kind of make them relevant to the overall story of Godzilla and the theme of the film, keeping the franchise rooted in the fear of radiation and the problems caused by our nuclear proliferation, both in regards to weaponry, using nuclear power as a power source, and just everything that we use in regards to nuclear power. And these creatures being so destructive and dangerous shows that they've woken up because we made the perfect world for them to come, spawn, and wipe us all out. It really works well with the overall poignancy of Godzilla that we've doomed ourselves, that our creation of this destructive power is the thing that's destroying us because we wake up these monsters and allow them to survive. I really, really like that in that way. And the EMP attack that the creatures use is also a really good way to both make the film fit in with the classic roots of the destruction of atomic energy, but also make the film feel very relevant to modern day concerns. Using EMPs in warfare is something that you see crop up a lot in modern day spy espionage war films, modern day war games like the Call of Duty series, and it's really cool that these monsters that are supposed to represent our fears are using EMPs, which can knock out electronics for a wide distance. And living in a world that relies so heavily on electronics and about being able to communicate with each other, it's really scary that we're being attacked by these monsters that can cut us off from that. You not being able to check your smartphone, all this different stuff, it leads to a really terrifying monster, and a monster that has an attack that's relevant to modern day concerns. So I really like that the movie is able to both make these creatures fit in with both the classic themes of Godzilla and classic Godzilla monsters that are based on atomic radiation, and also into modern day concerns with the EMP attack. Now, despite that, the EMP has received some criticism from people who say that there's no reason for the monsters to have an EMP attack since they're from a time where it wouldn't do anything. There were no electronics in their age to knock out with an EMP. So why the hell would they evolve to have it? Now, 2 things on that. I think there's 2 options that do make it make sense. One, it could be more of an after effect thing rather than them using it specifically as an attack. Since the creatures consume radiation and atomic explosions in the presence of radiation have been known to knock out electronics before, like nuclear blasts knocking out electronics for widespread distances, which we've seen in Godzilla movies before, like in The Return of Godzilla, when the aerial nuke both knocks out all the electronics in Tokyo and also wakes up Godzilla. But they do use the word attack in regards to the EMP in the movie, and also the way it's used, it always is used when the creatures need to defend themselves, like when the MUTO is being attacked by the military after it attacks the submarine. So it is clearly there used to be an attack. So how else does it make sense? Well, let's get into number 2. However, this reason got cut out of the movie, but it does exist. The EMP has been evolved by these creatures as a defense mechanism against Godzilla, their predator. This explanation got cut out of the movie, however, since later on in the film, in early drafts of the script when the monsters were fighting in San Francisco, Godzilla was supposed to try and use his atomic blast on the MUTO'S, but the EMP was supposed to cut it short and it was supposed to cancel out the attack. Godzilla's atomic breath being one of his primary weapons, it would make sense that creatures that his species would feed upon would evolve to protect themselves against that attack, and the EMP is genius in that way, but the sequence where it was supposed to be introduced got cut out of the movie. You can see where it was supposed to be, however, when Godzilla has the female MUTO down and he's about to kill her, he kind of breathes in, but is then stopped by the male MUTO, grabbing him and kind of flinging him around. Very clear to me that that scene is where Godzilla was supposed to charge up his blast, the male MUTO knock it out with an EMP, and that idea would have been introduced. It should have been in the frickin' movie. Because not only would it have given a more realistic reason for the MUTO'S to have an EMP, but it also would have more enhanced their connection to Godzilla, which is the next thing I want to talk about. I do really, really like the way the MUTO'S are kind of given a good, solid relationship with Godzilla. It's kind of an interesting way to do kind of monsters having enemies, because it's a little bit more realistic and animalistic than other Godzilla movies in the past, and it's the first time we've gotten a real predator-prey-esque relationship with Godzilla and his enemies. And it's really, really cool. Godzilla is the predators of the MUTO. The MUTO are his prey. He's the alpha apex predator of an ancient ecosystem in which the MUTO'S were a part of it. And that also gives them an interesting parasite-host relationship, which is introduced in one of the earliest scenes of the movie in the Philippines, where they find the two spores that hatch into the MUTO'S inside of the bones of an ancient Godzilla species. Which I like for a couple of reasons. Because again, it gives them a good connection to Godzilla, meaning that these monsters aren't just randomly showing up and Godzilla's just fighting them because his name is in the title. They have a previously established relationship. And what I also like about that scene in the Philippines is that we get to see that these creatures have killed Godzillas before, and that they're dangerous to Godzilla, that they can take him down. That despite him being the predators of the MUTO, that in the past, MUTO'S have taken down Godzilla. Now, the overall ins and outs of this did also get cut out of the movie, because the idea is supposed to be that not only does Godzilla want to kill the MUTO'S because he's their predator, but also the MUTO'S want to kill Godzilla because they want to use his carcass as a nest for their infants, which would have been really, really cool and given more stakes in regards to their fight. But overall, it is still good. And it's a realistic reason for monsters to want to fight each other rather than them just doing that because that's what they're supposed to do. However, speaking of their relationship with Godzilla, I do have the problem with the MUTO'S that they're too heavily focused on. Now, I kind of got into this earlier when I talked about the connections to Rodan, in that opening about smaller, weaker monsters building up to the bigger, stronger monster is fine, as long as once the bigger, stronger monster is introduced, the weaker monsters kind of take a backstage to the bigger monster. Not the case here at all. The movie is really, truly about the MUTO'S. The human story is mostly in connection to the MUTO'S, and the overall progression of the plot is about the MUTO'S. Trying to reproduce, going around feeding on radiation. The plot trying to kill the monsters is mostly reliant upon the MUTO'S, the radiation from the bombs leading the MUTO'S, and the force of the blast going to kill the MUTO'S. The story is almost entirely about them, and sadly Godzilla really kind of just gets thrown into the mix and just kind of tags along. His only connection to the overall military plot being that the MUTO'S will attract him as well, and that they can blow up all three of them in one go. So it almost feels to me like Godzilla is a co-star in their movie, which is not the way it should have been at all. It also goes back to something that I said a long time ago in old videos in which I talked about how I thought this movie should go and how it should be made. Early on, saying that I thought this movie should have just been about Godzilla and not have any other monsters in it at all, because the problem that could come up is that the monsters will steal focus away from Godzilla and it won't be enough about him. Guess what, kids? That's exactly what happened, and to even more of a degree than I think that I thought back then. And here's why it's a problem. The MUTO'S being the focus of the movie, the progression of the plot being about them, the military's plan to kill them being a major part of the story. Here's why it's a problem getting so invested in them and spending so much time on them. The only reason they exist is for Godzilla to kill them. Now I know that's a major oversimplification of the movie and of the characters, but at the end of the day, the movie is called Godzilla. There's a very, very slim chance, especially given how the MUTO'S are characterized in the movie, that the MUTO'S are going to kill Godzilla and that they're going to even have a chance of getting rid of him. We know that Godzilla is going to win and that he's going to kill them. So spending so much time building up to them and focusing on them and learning about them seems a little bit superfluous, because we just know that at the end of the day, this is all going to come down to Godzilla's going to get to them and tear them apart, because he's the king of the monsters and this is supposed to be his movie. Now the other thing is that this kind of overdevelopment of the MUTO'S is that it kind of leads to the way Godzilla kills them being kind of an anti-climax, because of how focused on them that we were. Not that Godzilla kills them necessarily easily, the fight is very brutal, as I'll get into later, but Godzilla just tearing them apart feels a little bit awkward because the movie was entirely about them. So Godzilla just killing them and then that being it is a little bit anticlimactic, because of how much of the story was about them and because of how little of it was about Godzilla. It's a major, major problem. But overall, I do really like the MUTO'S, and I do appreciate how much effort was put into them being given a strong connection to Godzilla. Speaking of that, let's get into where the major portion of this video is going to go, and I know I've been going on for a long time now, so I hope you'll all bear with me. And let's talk about the biggest portion of this movie, or at least it should have been. Let's talk about Godzilla, who is simultaneously the best thing about this movie and also the worst thing. Now, I know that's a very, very strange thing to say, but let me explain. Godzilla is absolutely the best thing about this movie because every scene he is in is made of pure atomic awesomeness. He has a commanding, powerful, larger-than-life presence, exactly how Godzilla should be perceived. They got his overall attitude perfect. And every time he is on screen, and whenever the movie is about him, I rise out of my seat cheering because of how badass it is. No matter how many times I watch the movie, knowing exactly what's going to happen, just like the scene where Sandra dies always eliciting tears from me, Godzilla's appearances always elicit cheers, which is awesome. And a lot of that has to do with the design, and it is, for the most part, an excellent reimagining of Godzilla. Now, it did have to grow on me, I will admit, and a lot of it over time. It has taken me years, in fact, given how long we've known basically what Godzilla was going to look like, to grow on me as a good version of Godzilla. Now, the things that initially really bugged me about the design were mainly the gills, of course, which, of course, Godzilla has never had in the past, and I still think are a strange addition. The lack of visible ears, which Godzilla has almost always had, no matter how many times his design has changed. And probably the biggest thing, his elephant-like stubby feet with those short little claws. Now again, these things still don't thrill me. I still think they're all very odd design choices, but they are overwhelmed by everything that the design gets right. The head and face are fantastic. He looks imposing, ancient, and very emotive. His head and face are extremely reminiscent of the Heisei Godzilla head, which is cool because that's my favorite Godzilla design. That kind of squarish, angry-looking face. It's very, very classic Godzilla, and I'm glad that that's the kind of head structure that they decided to go with because that's my favorite. Also, speaking of Heisei, his body also has appropriate mass, and it really makes Godzilla look indestructible and gives him that presence I just mentioned earlier, being commanding and imposing. He really feels like the king of the monsters. And perhaps most importantly, in regards to this being an American, modern, realistic approach at tackling Godzilla's design, the dude stands upright, walking on two legs, only a little bit hunched over, and he drags his tail on the ground like classic Godzilla. None of that frickin' Zilla 98 bullshit where he's all hunched over, his tail is completely horizontal like a dinosaur. They were like, we're gonna respect the roots and keep him standing upright, because that's how he looks powerful, that's the classic silhouette of Godzilla, and that's where all the badassness of his presence is most expressed. He feels like Godzilla. Now, in that respect, people have also criticized this redesign for being a little bit too fat, which I can see a little bit in the scene where near the end, where he kind of collapses into San Francisco. His gut looks a little bit hefty, and he looks almost too big, but I don't think it's to the extent that everybody said, and again, it gives him a sense of mass, and it makes him look like classic Godzilla. There's always been kind of a little bit of a gut going on with classic Godzilla, especially Heisei. He got very, very chunky in the later Heisei films, which was certainly a problem, but it was never something that crippled those movies, and I don't think it cripples this design at all. I think it works. Now, in regards to size, I do think that his spikes are actually a little bit too small, given how big Godzilla is in this movie. But aside from not quite being in proportion with the massiveness of this body, in fact, I've seen some fan redesigns online that give him bigger spines, and I think that would have been a good thing to do in the movie, again, given how frickin' enormous he is. They do hit all of the major notes of classic Godzilla spine. They're 3 rows of ever-increasingly larger spines that, when he's swimming, have that very classic kind of one kind of slanted, and one straight on kind of shark-like dorsal appearance in the water. I was really, really impressed and immediately blown away that was in this movie when I first saw it in the theater. I was cheering when I saw those 3 spikes. Now, they're not entirely reminiscent of classic Godzilla because the overall shape of the spines is more reminiscent of the Millennium Godzilla, specifically the Godzilla 2000 design, where they're very jagged and almost kind of wavy, and not that kind of traditional maple leaf shape that most classic Godzilla designs take. Again, it's very reminiscent of Godzilla 2000, where they're kind of crazy or a little bit more almost mutated looking. So I like that. They make sense, and I think they look great. And they still have all the classic trappings of good Godzilla spines. And overall, Godzilla's design is a good mix of dinosaurian aspects, respecting the classic Godzilla design, and also crocodilian attributes, befitting something a little bit more realistic given what Godzilla is, being an aquatic reptile that's the alpha predator of his environment, who also comes up on land. The design of his scales and the overall design of his bodily kind of shape is a little bit more reminiscent of crocodilians than it is traditional dinosaurs, which again, I think makes sense. And what I really like about that is the way Godzilla swims, swimming exactly like a crocodile, going from side to side using his tail to speed up and speed down. I really like that, and it looks really cool in the water. But his overall body structure is still very dinosaurian, being completely bipedal and having that kind of T-Rex-esque 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head. It still respects that classic dinosaurian nature, but the crocodilian aspects make it feel more realistic for a real creature, especially in the way he swims and in his body design, especially given what Godzilla is in this continuity. Not really being a dinosaur. So I like all of that design-wise. Now let's talk about Godzilla's powers, because I think they're also, like the design, all represented very, very well. While he doesn't interact a ton with the military in this, his His indestructibility is clear just by him surviving the H-bomb in 1954, and of course all the guns he gets hit with later in the movie not making any dent on him whatsoever. Which we mainly see when he attacks the bridge and all those tanks and guns get fired at him and they don't do shit. I mean, they make him sway a little bit, but they're just kind of... You gotta think that he hasn't interacted with any of this stuff in decades, and it would make sense that he would act with surprise just coming out of the water. So they don't hurt him at all, so his indestructibility is represented well. As well as his strength. He's easily able to overpower the MUTO'S in their fight later on in the movie, and his tail being strong enough to obliterate the male is awesome. So his strength is also well represented, and again, it just makes him feel like the king of the monsters. But the most important and exciting thing, of course, is the atomic breath. Something egregiously absent from America's last Godzilla adaptation. It's pretty spectacular here. The first time Godzilla uses it is highlighted with the proper build-up and weight that it truly deserves. It's one of the coolest scenes in the movie, and has also gone down as one of the most iconic. And it's also kind of a microcosm of how well they readapted Godzilla for the modern age. I was so sold on this new version of Godzilla that when I was watching the movie the first time, I forgot that he's supposed to have atomic breath. So when it finally popped in there, it was almost like a nice little surprise, almost like icing on the cake, and it just really, really made me happy as a fan. It also looks pretty awesome too, though at first I did have my issues with it. The first time I saw it, I thought it looked a little bit too much like basic fire, which is of course a major misconception people have about Godzilla's atomic breath. I also thought the first time that it wasn't really strong enough in the same respect to it just being fire, since it doesn't really do anything to the female MUTO aside from knock her to the ground and just kind of put her in a daze. However, I've pretty much completely changed my mind about it, because it really doesn't look anything like fire once you get a good look at it. It's very gassy looking, and not so much the blinding laser beam that it's been since '84 Godzilla. It's more of a throwback to the Showa-era Godzilla's atomic blast, which was more of a spread of atomic energy more than a concentrated beam, and wasn't able to blow monsters apart in one blast, like Godzilla was able to in Final Wars. Now, I like this because it makes for more challenging and exciting fights, since they aren't as easy for Godzilla. They're not just the energy beam battles that they were in the Heisei series. They're more visceral than that. And also, he seems to also be able to concentrate it into more of a straight beam like the Heisei and Millennium series, depending on how he's using it. Like when he fires it down the female's throat to blow her head off, it looks more like a straight beam rather than the kind of gaseous spray that it was earlier in the movie. Kind of making it the best of both worlds. Of course, also, it's bright blue, just as it should be. Overall, fantastic. I also like, building on making the fights more challenging, that it takes a lot out of him to use it, which doesn't make him feel weaker, just a little bit more grounded and realistic than he's been in the past 10 or 15 years. Since expelling that much concentrated radiation must drain a lot of power, and since he and the MUTO'S feed on nuclear energy to survive in this continuity, it makes sense that he'd only use it when necessary, and that it would drain as much energy from him as it does. However, this starts to bring us into murkier waters, namely Godzilla's origins in this continuity and his characterization. But let's start off with the revised origin. The big thing, of course, is that in this continuity, Godzilla is not a mutation, which, as I talked about in earlier videos, really irritated me at first. In this continuity, Godzilla has always looked like and been Godzilla, removing much of the tragedy of Godzilla being mutated by the radiation and being the only one of his kind. Part of the poignancy of movies like Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was that the radiation turned him into a freak and a monster, and also kind of removing him from the species of which he was the last. Which also made him unique because he was the only one of his kind. There was only one Godzilla, which was always something that was very cool about the character. However, that aspect of it is slightly retained by him being the last of his kind, which does retain his loneliness and slightly his uniqueness, because in the modern age, he is the only Godzilla left, and also, he is alone in the world. There's no other creature that he can call his kin, unlike the MUTO'S, which have each other, which makes him tragic in the greater tapestry of the monsters in this movie, and I'm glad that was retained. Though I'll never be crazy about there being a whole other species of Godzillas that could potentially be out there that look like that. I just like Godzilla being Godzilla, his own unique creature. I'm fine with there being a species that, that he came from, that was then mutated into him, but them all having the same powers and basically being the same creature as him, that's not so great in my eyes. But overall, his not being a mutation and just kind of being a creature that woke up is fine, and his new origin for the most part works. His emergence into the modern world is still facilitated by man's nuclear proliferation, and he's still somewhat nature's punishing mankind for its nuclear devastation. However, it was always important for the message and allegory of Godzilla that he was born or awakened out of violence, mainly the explosive power of the hydrogen bomb. In this version, it's nuclear submarines that awaken him, which kind of makes more sense in this continuity since Godzilla's kind went down into the depths to slumber at the bottom of the ocean and absorb radiation from the planet's core, so nuclear submarines allowing mankind to pierce deeper down into the depths than they ever had before does make more sense on that front, and also still kind of retains nuclear power, allowing us to go to places that we were never really supposed to go in regards to our power. But it still detracts from the original point of Godzilla, that kind of, nature's response to the devastating power of nuclear energy that man has awakened. Though I do still like that Godzilla's origin and emergence into the modern world is left in 1954, and Godzilla's connection to 1950s culture and the Cold War is still retained, with that scene in the conference room when Dr. Serizawa says that, or not Dr. Serizawa, where Dr. Graham says that when Godzilla first appeared and started destroying submarines, that America blamed Russia and the Russians blamed the Americans. So I do like that all of that is retained. And in terms of Godzilla's new origin, in terms of Godzilla being an ancient apex predator from a time when the Earth was 10 times more radioactive, in terms of I like Godzilla's kind being the apex group of predators of an ancient ecosystem of radioactive animals, since it gives a realistic, natural reason for him to be the king of the monsters. He's the biggest predator, the hunter of the smaller creatures. Which of course also retains Godzilla being radioactive, and being a creature that needs radiation to survive, like he was in the Heisei continuity, so I like all of that. But it also gives Godzilla a very interesting and kind of different characterization, that essentially takes his classic destroyer roots and puts a more heroic spin on it, which I know a lot of people didn't like, including yours truly when I initially saw the film. But like the design, it has grown on me over time, and I'll explain why. Godzilla's always been seen as the embodiment of nature's wrath, born out of man's destroying nature with atomic weapons sent to put man back in his place, show that nature is a much stronger force than anything man made. This version absolutely retains that by making him nature's balancing agent. Whenever the order of nature is disrupted, in this case the MUTO'S awakening and threatening the world with being overrun by their offspring, I really like that because it again uses real science to retain a classic aspect of Godzilla lore, and also gives a good reason for Godzilla to want to kill the MUTO'S. They're essentially an invasive species. The environment they awakened in changing so radically in their absence that they have no place in it and would ultimately destroy it. Also, without an entire species of Godzilla there to hunt them, they would completely overrun the planet, with human weapons powerless against them. Now, one thing commonly criticized about this relationship between the MUTO'S and Godzilla is that if he's hunting them, why doesn't he eat them once he kills them? Well, sadly, the movie doesn't really address this, but I think the idea is not so much that he's hunting them because he identifies them as food, but more out of territorial dominance, since Godzilla's an immensely large predator, especially in this movie making Godzilla the biggest that he's ever been at 350 feet. In nature, big predators have immense territories that other predators their size don't enter, because when they do, it leads to a clash over who gets it. This specifically has been seen in big reptiles, like anacondas and crocodiles, whose territories can stretch for miles. Now imagine how big Godzilla's territorial dominance would be. It might stretch to the whole Pacific Ocean. So the MUTO'S flying around his territory and also trying to reproduce in it definitely wouldn't be cool for a predator of his size and dominance. That would be seen as a threat. The other thing is that Godzilla might not have been around himself during the time when his kind actually ate the MUTO'S, since the movie is vague about how old Godzilla is specifically. Serizawa calls him an ancient alpha predator, but it's unclear whether he's referring to Godzilla himself or just generally his species. Regardless, Godzilla might be hunting them based just on instincts, his kind evolving specifically to hunt the MUTO'S kind. Those instincts would never really die no matter how much time passes, and regardless of Godzilla ever seeing a MUTO with his own eyes. Ultimately, my point is, it does make sense in the context of the story that Godzilla reappears to kill the MUTO'S and not necessarily eat them. However, the problem is that the film itself doesn't spend enough time explaining and fleshing out this relationship, which brings me into what is the single biggest problem with the entire film. Because remember, I said Godzilla is not only the best thing about the movie, but also the worst thing. The best because this rebooted version of him is awesome, and whenever he's on screen, I verbally scream in delight no matter how many times I see it. But the worst because, well, there just isn't enough of him. This has been the single most criticized aspect of the film since it came out, and the thing that almost everybody agrees is a major problem. Godzilla's not the focal point of the story at all. The human cast and MUTO'S truly taking center stage, leaving him mostly just to show up 2 or 3 times to try and kill the MUTO'S. Now let me be clear about this. I don't mind waiting an hour for Godzilla to make his grand entrance. That kind of build-up is welcome in monster movies, and the wait for Godzilla is a common part of the entire series. However, the best Godzilla movies, or at least my own personal favorites, are the ones that talk about Godzilla a lot, and all of the action building up to his appearance is because of him. The biggest examples of this being Godzilla vs. Biollante, The Return of Godzilla from 1984, and Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah from 1991, and yes, I know I completely fucked up the chronological order of how those movies came out. But anyway, that's not the case in this film at all. Godzilla isn't mentioned or really involved in anything that happens until roughly 45 minutes in, when Serizawa explains to Ford the history of Monarch and that the MUTO'S reappearance might lead to Godzilla's if they don't solve the problem quickly. Now again, that aspect of it I like, and I wish that that had been the major driving force of the tension of the movie. The MUTO'S reappearance facilitating the reappearance of Godzilla, and the military and Serizawa trying to prevent that from happening because Godzilla's way more dangerous than the MUTO'S combined. But this scene precedes Godzilla's appearance by only 10 minutes, making the 15-minute build-up superfluous since it does little for Godzilla himself. And the movie should have truly been about people in this world reacting to the threat posed by Godzilla and the existence of Godzilla. There's never really that sense of mass panic from the original or Godzilla 84 at the destructive prospects of Godzilla. And that, to me, has always been the most interesting part of Godzilla stories, the impact he has on the world at large. Again, like we see in Godzilla vs. Biollante, I'm sorry I keep bringing up that movie. But very little of that is explored in this movie, when again, I think it should have been the focal point. As it stands, we're left a little bit disappointed at how little of the story that was just told was actually about the title character, and not to mention how little of him we actually get to see. Which will bring me into one of the last things I want to talk about in this very, very long review. Again, thank you for sticking with me. And that is the cinematography, the special effects, and of course, the action. Let's start with how the movie is shot, mainly how Edwards shoots the giant monsters. First of all, I think the film is beautifully directed, shot, and overall put together. Edwards knows how to control an audience's emotions with just the camera and enhance the story's impact with how he shoots it. As I mentioned before, Godzilla's first appearance is awesome and treated as epically and importantly as it should be, especially since he hasn't been in a movie in 10 years. Edwards builds up that tilt up Godzilla's body so well that it truly does elicit the proper cheers and jaw drops from the audience. Now, this kind of wait-and-see style of shooting the monsters is really effective in that sense. The film effectively evokes the power and awe-inspiring nature of their size and destructive capabilities. This is definitely one of the most well-directed and shot films in recent memory for me. However, while waiting to see the monsters and not lingering on them for too long is a good idea in theory and works in quite a few scenes, Edwards does it throughout the entire movie, and especially in regards to Godzilla, it gets really frustrating really quickly. Every time we start to get a good look at him and see him do something cool, we cut away very quickly to the humans. Now, I get why Edwards does it this way. The idea is that we never see too much of Godzilla or the monsters fighting, that it loses its maximum effect. Also so that the scale and power of the monsters and fighting is never lost, which is why we never cut away from the humans particularly forward for too long. This is a fantastic idea in theory. However, in practice, what ends up happening is that the audience leaves the theater feeling like they didn't get enough of what they paid for, namely Godzilla kicking ass. It's a great way to present a monster movie. However, like anything, too much of it gets frustrating after a while. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that what we do get to see of Godzilla, and more importantly of Godzilla kicking the MUTO'S ass, is bad. To the absolute contrary. The monster fights in this movie are awesome. They're more animalistic and raw fights than classic Godzilla fights. Godzilla and the MUTO'S are clearly fighting for their lives, and in both cases for the future of their species. So they really go at each other, biting, stabbing, ramming, clobbering, and blasting the hell out of each other. Godzilla fights like a big predator should, using his mass to overpower his opponent, like the scene where he straightens his posture up and kicks the female MUTO to the ground and puts his foot down on her throat. He fights like a big bear, and that's awesome. But also, the flying male MUTO forces him to be more cunning and agile, having to grab the male with his mouth, and throwing and most impressively slamming him into a building with his tail. That move was fantastic and is really only possible thanks to the spectacular CGI, which will bring us into the special effects. Next to the modern Planet of the Apes series, this is some of the best CGI in recent memory, nearly perfectly blending the live, analog action with the digital effects. Now, I know everyone had tons of reservations about Godzilla being done in CGI after what happened in 1998, and also about how well a more traditional Godzilla design would translate into CG, myself included. But seeing the finished product, it's done perfectly. Godzilla and the MUTO'S look amazing. They look, move, and behave like real living creatures, and each monster, like the Suitimation days, ascends the manner in which the special effects brings them to life and convinces the audience of their realism in the film. Godzilla in particular truly comes to life in this movie. He looks absolutely photoreal. And what I love is that he takes moments to breathe, recover, and react in ways that real creatures do. Two scenes jump to mind that demonstrate this. The first is after Godzilla kills the male MUTO with his tail, and he just stops for a few seconds to breathe, and then reacts with shock that the building is about to fall on him. It's a nice moment where the movie slows down and shows that these creatures are real, and that they aren't just unemotional forces of nature. They have feelings. And the second one demonstrates this even better, right after when Ford is running to the docks, having been kicked around and exhausted by the night's events. He stops to catch his breath and looks up to see Godzilla crushed under the building right next to him. I love this moment. The two lock eyes and have a really emotional moment which prompts Ford to keep fighting. Because in this moment, Ford and the audience just get to appreciate the majesty of Godzilla, but also that he's alive and feels pain. Godzilla's face isn't one of rage or monstrousness. He looks old and tired, worn down from the fight for nature's balance, but seeming to acknowledge Ford and motivate him to not give up, even if you are crushed under a building. It's a beautiful moment, and made truly exquisite by the incredible detail on Godzilla's face and expressions, which is thanks in large part to the talent they sought after to help in bringing the monsters to life, including Weta and Andy Serkis, the greatest motion capture actor in the industry. Overall, the special effects are top-notch, and have truly demonstrated that a CG Godzilla can not only work, but can bring so much to the character that Suitimation simply never could given its limitations. Now, there's only one other major thing I want to talk about. Again, I know this review is crazy long, but I promise this is the last major thing, and that is the music and the sound design. Alexander Despot's score is fantastic. It has creepy, slow build-up and exciting, heart-pounding crescendos befitting of a great monster movie score. But also quieter, more string-based cues that enhance the more emotional scenes, whether they be human-based ones like Sandra Brody's death and the collapse of Janjira, or monster-based scenes like Godzilla and Ford's moment where they both look at each other. But my favorite cues are definitely the wave marking Godzilla's arrival, the use of Requiem from 2001: A Space Odyssey during the Halo jump, and the ending theme Back to the Sea, which is a triumphant piece befitting Godzilla's exit upon winning the battle. Excellent music score. Now, what's interesting about it is that I know a lot of people, again, including myself, were really hoping that the original Godzilla theme by Akira Ifukube would be in there, and were definitely disappointed that it was left out. Now, again, I don't know what their reasoning was, whether it was like some kind of legal thing where they just couldn't use the music because they didn't have the rights to it, or if they just left it out because it wasn't a piece that Alexander Despot recorded himself. But I do think it works, because one thing that I think people should remember is that not every single Godzilla movie uses the classic theme. Some of the best ones, in fact, leave it out, especially in regards to reboots. Like The Return of Godzilla from '84. The theme isn't in there at all. The soundtrack is completely original, and it completely works, being an epic modern revival to Godzilla. And I think Alexander Despot's score for this movie works in the same way. Sure, the theme song isn't in there, but it really feels like Godzilla, and really draws the audience into the emotional weight of the situation, and does befit a modern revival of Godzilla. Also, it's kind of in there in the main opening credits theme, so it is certainly part of it, but I do wish we would have gotten the classic theme in some capacity. It would have really hammered home this being a tried and true Godzilla movie. Even if they just would have had it in the closing credits, like in Godzilla 2000 and GMK. But the last thing I want to bring up is the sound design, mainly the monsters' roars. They're powerful, earth-shattering, and effectively relate what the monsters are doing or how they're feeling. The reworking of Godzilla's roar in particular is very strong, retaining all of its classic elements while also giving it a new spin, similar to what was done in the Heisei and Millennium series. However, while the sound design is excellent for the most part, there are a few noticeable and annoying moments where certain sounds either don't exist and should, or don't carry and should. The former is that rarely do you hear or feel the monster's footsteps, and them being as big as they are in this movie, you really ought to. And also, there's a massive precedence in classic Godzilla movies for Godzilla's thunderous footsteps marking his arrival, in particular the original movie. That's the first thing we hear from him, so we really should have heard them in this movie. The latter is really only one moment, but it's one of the film's major moments, and it really bugs me. When Godzilla emerges from the smoke and roars directly into the camera during the San Francisco fight, his roar lasts for like 25 seconds, but never really ends per se. The camera just cuts away and the roar is cut off, and then we're just left with silence, followed by the female Muto roaring. It should have either ended during the sequence of Godzilla roaring into the camera, or carried into the next shot when the female Muto roars, and they could have kind of blended together, which could have been really cool. But those two things are of course massive nitpicks. So, with almost 2.5 hours of audio recorded, let's get into the conclusion. All in all, Godzilla 2014 is an entertaining, well-made monster movie that is always an enjoyable experience every time I pop it in. However, it is a heavily flawed film that's sadly disappointing in the area where it really needed to be amazing, as a modern Godzilla movie. Again, not that it's a poor adaptation or disrespectful to the character, but that it's not enough about him and doesn't effectively reintroduce him to a modern audience. Also suffering from being a movie that at many points is too forcibly designed to fit a certain mold rather than letting things flow naturally. However, while its execution is sometimes shaky, its ideas are really strong, and its reverence for the source material really shines through, making many references to classic Godzilla films, like that now famous moment where you cut to a fish tank early in the movie where you see that Mothra is written on it and there's a hatched cocoon inside of it. and one that's more subtle later in the movie, but I think is supposed to be a reference to classic Godzilla, where you cut to a Chinese dragon's head being swallowed in gasoline, and the head looks very much so like one of Ghidorah's heads, but that one I'm not so sure about. But more importantly than that even, the film retains the core themes of nature's power and nuclear devastation that have kept Godzilla relevant, popular, and poignant for over 60 years. So, after 5 years of build-up, dozens of videos, the formation of a podcasting network, and me meeting several of my now closest friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to rate Godzilla 2014. And this was one of the most difficult things that I have ever had to do. Again, this movie has so much good, but it does fall short in many areas. So all in all, I am going to give Godzilla 2014 a solid 4 out of 5. It's an entertaining movie, it's a well-made movie, but it does fall a bit short as a Godzilla movie, which is where that point went. Well, it looks like that finally concludes my overly long, definitely, analysis of Godzilla 2014 and my addendum to Godzilla Palooza. However, before I go, I would like to kind of give some sense of closure to this video, since sadly we're going to have to wait another really long time for the next Godzilla movie. With Legendary greenlighting 2 sequels to this movie, making this a Godzilla trilogy, which is awesome, but sadly not putting the release date until 2018, because Gareth Edwards had to go off and make a Star Wars movie. But despite all the problems with their marketing, despite all the problems the film has, you gotta give Legendary props, because they certainly resurrected Godzilla in a big bad way. The franchise is back. We've got comics still going on at IDW. We've got a PS3 and PS4 game coming to America this summer for the first time since Godzilla Unleashed, which is also awesome. So at least we do have something to tide us over until Godzilla 2, which again is a really far and long away. So it looks like I'm not going to have to bring back this series until then, so cool, I can give Godzilla Palooza a nice little 4-year-long rest until I get to come back and overanalyze another Godzilla movie for you guys. Huh? What was that? No, you can't be serious. What do you mean Toho's making another Godzilla movie separate from Legendary? And it's coming out when? Oh, alright, I see. Thank you, non-existent producer. You're very helpful as always. Well, kids, looks like I'm not going to be able to give Godzilla Palooza as long of a rest as I thought, because I will be back with you next year in 2016 when we get into Toho's next independent Godzilla movie. I hope you'll join me for that review. So until next time, kids, sayonara.